Welcome, weary wanderer, to a journey through the forgotten kingdoms that time has nearly erased from memory. Tonight, we explore the lost realms that existed before history became legend. Kingdoms that vanished into mystery, yet left whispers of their presence in ancient stones and sacred ruins. These are the civilizations that transcended mortal understanding, realms that existed between dimensions, above clouds, and beneath the waves of time itself. So settle into your dreams, let your mind drift like morning mist through these vanished worlds. Close your eyes when you're ready, and let us walk together through kingdoms that exist now only in theory and wonder. In the beginning, when the world was young and the boundaries between mortal and divine were as thin as spider's silk, there existed a people whose very name has become synonymous with mystery itself, the Zonai, as they came to be known in the scattered fragments of ancient lore that survived their disappearance, were perhaps the most enigmatic civilization ever to walk the lands that would one day be called Hyrule. They were not merely builders or craftsmen, though their architectural achievements would make the gods themselves pause in wonder. They were not simply mages or scholars, though their understanding of the fundamental forces that govern reality exceeded anything that would come after them. The Zonai were something far more profound and impossible to categorize. They were the bridge between the celestial realm of pure thought and the earthbound world of stone and flesh. The very ruins they left behind speak of minds that conceived reality in ways that conventional understanding cannot grasp. Where other civilizations built temples to honor the gods, the Zonai constructed spaces that seemed to exist partially outside normal dimensions, their architecture flowing like frozen music through patterns that the eye could follow, but the mind could never fully comprehend. Every wall bore spirals that seemed to turn inward upon themselves in impossible geometries, while stone dragons wound through their structures, as if the very concept of dragons had been given physical form and taught to dance through three-dimensional space. Their mastery over what lesser minds would call magic was so complete that it appeared to be something else entirely, a natural harmony with the fundamental principles that governed all existence. Where others struggled to bend the elements to their will through ritual and incantation, the Zonai simply asked reality politely to arrange itself differently, and reality, recognizing wisdom when it encountered it, graciously complied. The spiral motifs that adorned every Zonai structure were far more than mere decoration, though their beauty was such that angels might have wept to witness them. These flowing patterns represented the Zonai understanding of time itself, not as a river flowing from past to future, but as an eternal dance where all moments existed simultaneously, where cause and effect spiraled through each other in patterns too complex for linear thinking to unravel. It was through these spirals that the Zonai achieved their greatest triumph and perhaps their ultimate tragedy. They learned to step outside the normal flow of time, to view existence from perspectives that transcended the limitations of mortal perception. They could see the threads that connected all things, the delicate web of cause and consequence that bound every atom to every star. But such knowledge came with a price that perhaps even they had not fully anticipated. To see reality from the perspective of the eternal is to become eternal oneself, to transcend the comfortable boundaries that separate one thing from another. The Zonai began to fade from the physical world, not through death or destruction, but through a kind of sublime transformation that defied every category their descendants would use to understand existence. The dragons that feature so prominently in their art were not merely symbolic representations, but actual beings with whom they shared some profound connection. These ancient worms, creatures of such power and wisdom that they seemed to embody the very forces of nature itself, were perhaps the Zonai's closest companions, in their exploration of reality's deepest mysteries. Some scholars who have dedicated their lives to studying the scattered remnants of Zonai civilization theorize that these dragons were once Zonai themselves, transformed through processes that transcended the normal boundaries between mortal and divine. Others suggest that the dragons were the Zonai's teachers, beings from realms beyond ordinary space, who shared their knowledge with a people wise enough to receive it. The truth, as is so often the case with the Zonai, likely encompasses both possibilities and several others that mortal minds have yet to imagine. The dragons and the Zonai existed in a relationship that cannot be adequately described using concepts like teacher and student, friend and companion, or even separate and distinct beings. They were parts of a greater whole that included not just themselves but the very landscape they inhabited, the sky they flew through, and the dreams they shared. When the first Hylians began to explore the lands that would become their kingdom, they found Zonai ruins in the most unexpected places, perched on mountaintops that seemed impossible to reach, hidden in valleys that appeared on no maps, suspended in mid-air, as if gravity had simply forgotten to claim them. These structures were not built according to any earthly logic, but seemed to follow principles that belonged to some more fundamental order of reality. The technology that the Zonai left behind, if it could be called technology in any sense that conventional thinking would recognize, defied every attempt at understanding or replication. Their devices did not operate through mechanical principles or magical energies as other civilizations understood them, but seemed to function through harmony with natural forces that remained invisible to less enlightened perception. The massive stone spheres that could be found throughout Zonai ruins were perhaps the most enigmatic of their creations. These perfect orbs of stone, some small enough to hold in one's hands, and others so large they could serve as the foundations for temples, possessed properties that seemed to alter depending on the intentions of those who encountered them. They could be light as feathers or immovable as mountains, hot as forge fire or cool as morning dew, all depending on factors that had nothing to do with their physical composition and everything to do with the deeper harmonies that govern their existence. The Zonai's relationship with the divine realm was unlike that of any other civilization known to history, where others sought to petition the gods or win their favor through worship and sacrifice. The Zonai seemed to exist in a state of constant collaboration with forces that transcended ordinary divinity. They were not subjects seeking the attention of distant rulers, but partners working together with powers that were themselves still exploring the infinite possibilities of existence. This partnership manifested most clearly in their approach to what other cultures would call magic. The Zonai did not cast spells or perform rituals in any recognizable sense. Instead, they seemed to simply ask the universe to reveal its deeper nature, and the universe, recognizing their genuine desire to understand rather than control, would grant them glimpses of the profound patterns that connected all things. Their ability to manipulate matter and energy was so seamless that it appeared effortless, like breathing or thinking. They could reshape stone as easily as others might mold clay, call forth springs of fresh water from barren earth, or cause plants to grow in ways that perfectly complemented their architectural visions. Yet these abilities were never used for conquest or domination, but always in service of a deeper harmony that encompassed both their own needs and the well-being of the entire world. The Great Sky Island, that massive chunk of Earth suspended impossible distances above the surface world, represents perhaps the most visible testament to Zonai mastery over the fundamental forces of existence. This floating realm, larger than most kingdoms, and more beautiful than the dreams of poets, defies every law that conventional thinking uses to understand how the world works. Yet to the Zonai, the Sky Island was not a violation of natural law, but a perfect expression of deeper principles that most minds were simply too small to comprehend. They understood that gravity was merely one force among many, and that with sufficient understanding of the relationships between all forces, it was possible to create spaces where different rules applied without disturbing the greater harmony that governed all existence. The temples and shrines that dotted the Sky Island were not built according to any earthly blueprint, but seemed to grow from the landscape itself like flowers blooming in a garden tended by invisible hands. Each structure was perfectly positioned to take advantage of celestial alignments, wind patterns, and subtle energy flows that remained completely undetectable to less sensitive perception. Within these sacred spaces, the Zonai practiced arts that cannot be adequately described using any vocabulary available to modern understanding. They were simultaneously scientists and mystics, architects and philosophers, gardeners and poets. Their every activity was both practical and spiritual, serving immediate needs while contributing to a greater work that encompassed the well-being of all existence. The relationship between individual Zonai and their civilization was unlike anything that would develop in later ages, where other cultures were built around hierarchies and social structures that separated ruler from ruled, teacher from student. The Zonai seemed to exist in a state of fluid cooperation, where each individual contributed their unique perspective to a collective understanding that grew stronger through diversity, rather than weaker through disagreement. Perhaps this is why their civilization ultimately transcended physical existence rather than collapsing through internal conflict or external conquest. The Zonai had achieved something that other cultures could only dream of: a perfect balance between individual expression and collective harmony, a society where personal growth contributed to universal well-being and universal wisdom enhanced personal understanding. The few Zonai who remained in physical form long enough to interact with other civilizations became legendary figures whose influence shaped the development of entire cultures. Rauru, the sage who would eventually become a founding figure in Hyrulean history, carried within him the accumulated wisdom of his people, while remaining approachable enough to form meaningful relationships with beings of more limited understanding. Through Rauru and others like him, the Zonai legacy lived on not as a lost golden age to be mourned, but as an active influence that continued to guide the development of wisdom and understanding in the world. The temples they built, the knowledge they shared, and the example they provided continued to inspire seekers of truth long after the last of their kind had faded into whatever realm they had chosen for their final transformation. Yet even their direct influence was subtle and respectful, never seeking to impose their superior understanding, but always ready to offer guidance to those who approached with genuine desire to learn. They understood that wisdom could not be forced upon unwilling minds, but had to be discovered through personal experience and individual growth. The theories surrounding the Zonai's ultimate fate are as varied and mysterious as the civilization itself. Some believe they ascended to a higher plane of existence, becoming one with the divine forces they had spent so long studying. Others suggest they simply chose to step outside the normal flow of time, continuing their explorations in dimensions that remain invisible to ordinary perception. A few bold theorists propose that the Zonai never truly disappeared at all, but merely learned to exist in ways that make them undetectable to less evolved consciousness. According to this view, they continue their great work in the present day, subtly guiding the development of wisdom and understanding, while remaining carefully hidden from those who might misuse their knowledge. What seems certain is that the Zonai achieved something unprecedented in the history of conscious beings. They learned to transcend the limitations of physical existence without losing their essential nature as individuals. They became more than they had been without ceasing to be themselves, a transformation that represents the ultimate goal of every spiritual tradition, yet one that they achieved not through renunciation of the world, but through deeper engagement with its fundamental mysteries. Their ruins remain scattered throughout the lands that would become Hyrule, silent witnesses to a civilization that achieved heights of understanding that others can barely imagine. These stone spirals and dragon carvings speak to anyone willing to listen of possibilities that transcend conventional limitations, of ways of being that honor both individual consciousness and universal harmony. In the quiet moments when dawn light first touches these ancient stones, when the wind moves through their carved channels in ways that create music no earthly instrument could produce, it becomes possible to sense something of what the Zonai understood so clearly. The boundaries between self and cosmos begin to soften. The artificial divisions between matter and spirit start to dissolve. And for just a moment, one can glimpse the deeper patterns that connect all things in an eternal dance of meaning and beauty. The Zonai legacy is not found in any treasure that can be claimed or technology that can be reproduced. It lives instead in the recognition that existence itself is far more mysterious and wonderful than most minds dare to imagine, that the universe is not a collection of separate objects, but a single living system of infinite complexity and perfect harmony. To study the Zonai is to be changed by them, to discover that the questions they explored continue to resonate in the deepest chambers of consciousness, where individual awareness touches universal understanding. Their greatest gift is not any specific knowledge or technique, but the recognition that reality is an active participant in its own understanding, always ready to reveal new depths to minds that approach with genuine curiosity and respect. In the end, perhaps that is why the Zonai vanished in the way they did, not because they failed or were conquered, but because they succeeded so completely that physical existence could no longer contain what they had become. They graduated from the school of material reality and moved on to explorations that required different forms of being, different ways of experiencing the infinite creativity that flows through all existence. Yet their influence continues, woven into the very foundations of the world they once walked, present in every spiral pattern that catches the eye and holds it, in every moment when the impossible suddenly seems perfectly natural, in every recognition that individual consciousness and universal wisdom are not separate things but different aspects of a single, ever-unfolding mystery that encompasses everything that has ever been or ever could be. Above the mundane concerns of earthbound kingdoms, where clouds gather like thoughts at the edge of consciousness and winds carry whispers of forgotten songs, there existed realms that challenged every assumption about what was possible in the ordered world below. These were the Sky Kingdoms, civilizations that had chosen to make their homes in the infinite blue expanse above, where the very air itself became foundation and the horizon stretched endlessly in all directions. To understand these aerial realms is to abandon the comfortable certainties that govern life upon solid ground, where up and down maintain their familiar meanings, and gravity provides the constant reassurance of weight and substance. In the Sky Kingdoms, such limitations became merely suggestions, guidelines that could be followed or transcended, depending on the wisdom and will of those who dwelt among the clouds. The most mysterious of these elevated civilizations were the Oka, beings whose very existence seemed to bridge the gap between the earthbound and the divine. These ethereal creatures, with their serpentine forms and gossamer wings that caught light like captured rainbows, had achieved something that no ground-dwelling race had ever managed. They had learned to make the sky itself their permanent home. The Yucca were not visitors to the aerial realm, tourists who occasionally ventured upward from more solid foundations. They were native children of the wind and weather, beings who had been born in the spaces between earth and heaven, and had never known the need to anchor themselves to anything more substantial than their own boundless imaginations. Their very physiology spoke of adaptation to an environment where traditional concepts of shelter and stability held no meaning. Their great city, suspended in defiance of every law that mortal minds use to understand how the world functions, represented perhaps the pinnacle of architectural achievement in any realm, terrestrial or celestial. The city in the sky was not built upon any foundation that conventional engineering would recognize, yet it had endured for ages beyond counting, its graceful spires and flowing walkways as permanent as mountains and as ethereal as dreams. The construction of such a marvel required understanding that transcended mere mastery of physical forces. The Yucca had discovered principles that allowed matter and energy to exist in states of perfect balance, where the opposing forces of gravity and levitation created stable points of equilibrium that could support entire districts of their impossible metropolis. Every surface of their city reflected their unique understanding of beauty and function, where architectural necessity and artistic expression had merged into something that served both purposes with equal perfection. The walls seemed to flow like water frozen in the moment of falling, while bridges spanned impossible distances with materials so fine they appeared to be woven from crystallized air and captured starlight. Within this aerial paradise, the Oka had developed arts and sciences that bore little resemblance to the disciplines practiced in earthbound civilizations. Their scholars did not study books but observed the patterns of cloud formation and wind direction, reading in the movements of atmospheric pressure the same fundamental truths that others sought in dusty tomes and ancient scrolls. Their understanding of flight transcended the mechanical approaches that other races would eventually develop, where ground dwellers would build machines to carry them temporarily into the sky. The Yucca had learned to exist in a state of permanent harmony with the forces that governed aerial movement. They did not fly so much as participate in flight, becoming part of the same natural processes that carried birds and guided the paths of migrating butterflies. This mastery extended to their relationship with time itself, which seemed to flow differently in the rarefied atmosphere of their high kingdom. Seasons passed more gently in their city, marked not by the harsh transitions that govern terrestrial life, but by subtle shifts in wind patterns and cloud formations that spoke to those who knew how to listen. The Oka had developed a calendar based entirely on celestial observations, tracking not just the movements of sun and moon, but the complex dance of atmospheric conditions that created the ever-changing tapestry of their skyborne environment. Their festivals celebrated the marriage of different air currents, the birth of new cloud formations, and the ancient songs that could be heard when wind moved through their crystalline architecture in precisely the right combinations. Yet for all their mastery of aerial existence, the Oka maintained connections to the world below that spoke of wisdom rather than isolation. They understood that their sky kingdom existed in delicate balance with terrestrial forces, that the health of their elevated realm depended on the well-being of the earth beneath them. They served as guardians of the barrier between earth and sky, ensuring that the natural boundaries remained intact while permitting certain forms of beneficial exchange. Through carefully controlled portals and ancient technologies that defied earthbound understanding, they maintained communication with surface dwellers while preserving the sanctity of their celestial domain. The temples that connected their city to the world below were marvels of engineering that operated according to principles no ground-based civilization had ever mastered. These structures existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, their foundations anchored in solid earth while their upper reaches dissolved into the infinite expanse of sky. Through these sacred spaces, worthy visitors from the surface world could experience something of what life was like in the aerial realm, though such journeys were never undertaken lightly. The transition from earthbound to skyborne existence required preparation of both body and spirit. a gradual acclimatization to ways of being that challenged every assumption about what was normal or natural. The few surface dwellers who had been granted passage to the city in the sky spoke of experiences that transcended ordinary language. They described walking on paths made of solidified cloud, breathing air so pure it seemed to nourish not just the body, but the soul itself, and witnessing sunrises and sunsets that painted the entire world in colors that had no names in earthbound tongues. But perhaps most profound was their encounter with the Oka themselves, beings whose wisdom had been shaped by perspectives that no earth-dwelling mind could fully comprehend. To see the world from such heights, to understand weather patterns as intimate friends, and to know the sky in all its moods and possibilities, created a form of consciousness that was both deeply peaceful and infinitely expansive. The Uka spoke, when they chose to communicate with visitors, of truths that could only be understood from their elevated perspective. They had learned to see the connections that linked all things, the invisible threads of cause and consequence that wove through every level of reality, from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest reaches of the atmosphere. Their philosophy embraced what they called the Great Circulation, the eternal flow of energy and consciousness that moved through all realms like breath moving through a vast living body. From their aerial vantage point, they could observe this flow directly, watching how actions taken on the surface world rippled upward through the atmosphere, while influences from the celestial realm descended like gentle rain to nourish the earth below. This understanding led them to serve as intermediaries between the earthbound and the divine, translating messages that originated in realms too ethereal for ordinary consciousness to comprehend into forms that surface dwellers could begin to understand. They were the interpreters of heaven's will, the messengers who carried divine wisdom downward while bearing earthly prayers upward on wings of pure devotion. Yet their role as intermediaries was exercised with tremendous discretion and careful judgment. The Uka understood that direct intervention in earthly affairs could disrupt the delicate balance that allowed all realms to coexist in harmony. They offered guidance when it was sought with genuine humility, but they never imposed their wisdom on those who were not ready to receive it. Their city served as both sanctuary and training ground, a place where souls from any realm could come to expand their understanding of what was possible when consciousness learned to transcend its customary limitations. The educational programs they offered were unlike anything available elsewhere, focusing not on the accumulation of facts but on the development of perception itself. Students who came to learn from the Oka were taught to see through different eyes, to understand reality from perspectives that had never occurred to them during their earthbound existence. They learned to read the languages written in cloud formations and wind patterns, to hear the music that played constantly in the interaction between atmospheric pressures and celestial influences. Most importantly, they learned to experience themselves as participants in processes far larger than individual existence, to understand their own consciousness as part of the same infinite awareness that moved the stars and guided the migrations of birds. This recognition transformed not just their understanding of the world, but their relationship to their own lives, revealing possibilities for growth and service that had previously remained invisible. The technological achievements of the Uka reflected their unique understanding of the relationships between matter, energy, and consciousness. Their devices operated not through mechanical principles, but through harmony with natural forces, becoming extensions of their users' intentions, rather than separate tools that had to be manipulated through external effort. Their flying vessels, when they chose to create them, were works of art as much as transportation, graceful forms that moved through the sky like living creatures rather than artificial constructs. These aerial craft responded to their pilots' thoughts and emotions, becoming more maneuverable when guided by confident hands, and more stable when directed by peaceful hearts. But perhaps their greatest technological achievement was the city itself, which they had somehow taught to exist in a state of permanent flight without requiring any visible means of support. The secret of this accomplishment lay not in defying natural laws, but in discovering principles that operated at levels too subtle for ordinary observation to detect. The Oka had learned to work with what they called the deep currents, flows of energy that moved through reality at frequencies that existed below the threshold of normal perception. By aligning their city with these invisible rivers of force, they had created a form of levitation that was actually more stable than conventional foundations, anchored not in temporary matter, but in the eternal patterns that governed all existence. Their understanding of these deep currents allowed them to share their knowledge with other civilizations, though always in forms that could be safely integrated into existing cultures without causing disruption. The floating islands that could be found in various realms throughout history often bore traces of Oka influence, evidence of their quiet efforts to spread the possibility of aerial existence to others who were ready to embrace such expansion. Yet they were careful never to simply transplant their own solutions to environments where they might not be appropriate. Each civilization that received their guidance was encouraged to develop its own unique relationship with the forces that governed flight, creating aerial realms that reflected local wisdom and cultural values, rather than mere imitations of the Uka model. This respectful approach to cultural exchange reflected their deep understanding of the importance of diversity in the cosmic order. They recognized that the sky was large enough to accommodate many different approaches to aerial existence, that the principles they had mastered could be expressed through countless variations without losing their essential effectiveness. Their relationships with surface kingdoms were characterized by the same thoughtful discretion, offering assistance when it was needed while carefully avoiding the kind of dependence that could weaken the recipient's ability to solve their own problems. They served as advisors rather than rulers, teachers rather than dictators, always working to enhance local capabilities rather than replacing them with superior but alien alternatives. The gradual decline of the Oka civilization remains one of the great mysteries of aerial history. Unlike earthbound kingdoms that fell through conquest or internal collapse, the sky realm seems to have faded through a kind of voluntary transcendence, its inhabitants choosing to move on to even more ethereal forms of existence rather than maintaining their physical city. Some scholars who have studied the fragments of Uka history that remain accessible suggest that their civilization achieved its ultimate purpose and simply graduated to whatever comes after even the mastery of skyborne existence. According to this theory, the city in the sky was never intended as a permanent residence, but as a temporary school where consciousness could learn the lessons necessary for even greater forms of transcendence. Others propose that the Oka discovered something in their explorations of the deep currents that called them to ventures beyond the scope of any physical realm, no matter how elevated or sophisticated. They may have encountered forms of existence that made even their sky kingdom seem limiting, possibilities for being that required them to abandon all material anchors in favor of pure spiritual flight. What seems certain is that their departure was voluntary and peaceful, marked not by destruction or tragedy, but by a kind of joyful completion. The few records that survive speak of celebration rather than sorrow, of gratitude for lessons learned, and excitement for adventures yet to come. Their empty city remains suspended in the sky like a monument to achieved possibility, its graceful architecture continuing to demonstrate that matter and energy can be convinced to behave in ways that conventional thinking considers impossible. Those who encounter it report feelings of profound peace mixed with infinite longing, as if the very stones remember what it felt like to be home to beings who had learned to make the sky their natural element. The influence of the Oka extends far beyond their physical achievements. touching every subsequent attempt to create aerial civilizations or develop technologies that work in harmony with natural forces rather than against them. Their example continues to inspire inventors and visionaries, philosophers and mystics, anyone who suspects that reality contains possibilities that conventional wisdom has not yet begun to explore. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the sky holds that perfect balance between darkness and light, it becomes possible to sense something of what the Uka experienced during their long residence among the clouds. The air itself seems to hold memories of their passage, whispers of conversations conducted in languages that used wind and weather as vocabulary, echoes of songs that were sung in harmony with the great atmospheric rhythms that govern all aerial existence. To stand in such moments with face turned skyward is to receive a gift from those vanished masters of flight, a reminder that consciousness need not be limited by the boundaries that seem so solid and permanent from earthbound perspectives. The sky remains what it always was for the Ooka, not empty space to be traversed but living medium to be inhabited, not absence to be feared but presence to be celebrated. Their greatest legacy may be the recognition that up and down are merely directions rather than absolute categories, that the question is not whether flight is possible, but whether we possess sufficient courage and imagination to discover the principles that make it not just possible but natural. In learning to make their home among the clouds, the Oka proved that consciousness itself has wings, and that any limitation we accept is ultimately a choice rather than an unchangeable fact. The sky kingdoms they established and the aerial realm they made their own continue to exist in potential, waiting for new generations of skyborn consciousness to discover the deep currents and learn once again how to make the infinite blue expanse a home rather than merely a destination. Their empty city calls across the centuries to anyone with sufficient vision to hear it, promising that the sky remains open to those who approach it with the proper combination of wisdom, courage, and wonder. Between the realm of light where mortals dwell and the void where darkness reigns absolute, there exists a dimension that defies every comfortable assumption about the nature of reality itself. This is the Twilight Realm, a kingdom born not from natural processes or divine creation, but from the consequences of choices made in ages so distant that their echoes have become the stuff of myth and legend. To understand the Twilight Realm is to confront the profound truth that reality is far more malleable than most minds dare to contemplate, that the boundaries between different states of existence are maintained not by immutable laws, but by the collective will of conscious beings who have agreed, consciously or otherwise, to honor certain limitations. The Twilight Realm stands as eternal testament to what happens when those agreements are broken, when the careful balance between light and shadow is disturbed by those who seek to claim power that was never meant to be possessed by mortal hands. The origins of this shadow kingdom stretch back to a time when magic flowed through the world like water through a riverbed, when the barriers between different realms were thin as gossamer and twice as fragile. In those ancient days, there existed a tribe of people whose mastery over the mystical arts exceeded even their own understanding of the forces they wielded with such casual confidence. These were the interlopers, though that name would come later, attached to them by those who judged their actions through the lens of consequences rather than intentions. In their own time, they were simply the seekers, individuals who had dedicated their lives to pushing the boundaries of what was possible, explorers of the infinite territories that lay hidden within the depths of consciousness itself. Their studies had led them deep into the mysteries of shadow magic, that most dangerous and seductive of all the mystical arts, where others worked with light, which revealed and illuminated but could never be used to hide or transform. They chose to explore the properties of darkness, which could conceal and alter, but carried within it the constant temptation to lose oneself in its shifting depths. Shadow magic was not inherently evil, despite what later generations would believe after witnessing its corrupted applications. In its pure form, it was simply another aspect of the cosmic balance, the necessary counterpart to light that allowed for the existence of depth, mystery, and the kind of profound change that could only occur when old forms were dissolved to make way for new possibilities. But power without wisdom is perhaps the most dangerous force in any universe, and the interlopers had grown drunk on their abilities without developing the moral framework necessary to guide their application. They began to see themselves not as students of natural forces, but as masters of reality itself. Beings whose superior understanding gave them the right to reshape the world according to their own desires. Their greatest ambition was nothing less than the conquest of the sacred realm, that divine dimension where the Triforce itself resided in eternal balance. They believed that by seizing control of this ultimate source of power, they could remake all existence according to their vision of perfect order, eliminating suffering and uncertainty by imposing their will upon every aspect of reality. The attempt itself was an act of such monumental hubris that it shook the very foundations of the cosmic order. These mortals, for all their power and knowledge, were seeking to claim dominion over forces that governed the existence of gods themselves. Their magical abilities, impressive as they were in earthly terms, were utterly inadequate for the task they had set themselves. But the consequences of their attempt reached far beyond mere failure. When they tried to breach the barriers that protected the sacred realm, their combined will and magical energy created ripples that disturbed the careful balance between all dimensions. The light spirits, those ancient guardians whose duty it was to maintain the boundaries between realms, found themselves forced to act in ways they had hoped would never be necessary. The judgment they rendered was both merciful and terrible, shaped by wisdom that took into account not just the interlopers' crimes, but their essential nature as conscious beings deserving of continued existence. Rather than simply destroying them, which would have been the easiest solution, the light spirits chose to transform their punishment into an opportunity for eventual redemption. They created an entirely new realm, a dimension that existed in eternal twilight between the absolutes of light and darkness. This was to be the interlopers' new home, a place where they could exist without threatening the stability of other realms, while being given eons to contemplate the consequences of their actions and perhaps, eventually, to find their way back to wisdom. But transformation on such a scale required more than simply moving the interlopers from one place to another. Their very nature had to be altered to allow them to exist in a realm where the normal rules of physical existence held no sway. They became the Twili, beings of living shadow who could exist in the spaces between light and darkness, neither fully material nor entirely spiritual. The transformation was not merely physical, but touched every aspect of their existence. Their thoughts moved more slowly than they had when filtered through mortal brains, but they gained depth and complexity that more than compensated for their reduced speed. Their emotions became more subtle, but also more profound, no longer subject to the sudden storms that characterized earthly feeling, but flowing instead like deep currents that shaped their consciousness over periods measured in centuries rather than moments. Their new forms reflected the twilight nature of their realm, bodies that seemed to be composed of liquid shadow given temporary solidity through will and desire. They could alter their appearance at need, becoming more substantial when focus was required, or more ethereal when they wished to move through their domain like living thoughts. The Twilight Realm itself was shaped by their collective consciousness in ways that no earthly kingdom could ever be. Its landscapes shifted and flowed according to the dreams and memories of its inhabitants, creating vistas that were simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Mountains rose and fell, based on the metaphorical heights and depths of Twili emotions, while rivers flowed along paths determined by the currents of their shared thoughts. Cities in the Twilight Realm were not built but grown, emerging from the interaction between individual will and collective need like flowers blooming in a garden tended by invisible hands. Architecture followed no earthly logic, but obeyed instead the deeper principles of meaning and symbol, creating structures that served their intended functions perfectly, while remaining impossible to describe using conventional vocabulary. The palace where their royalty dwelt was perhaps the most magnificent of these dream-made manifest structures, a flowing work of crystallized twilight that changed its configuration based on the needs and moods of its inhabitants. Its walls were permeable to thought, but impervious to unwelcome intentions. Its chambers expanded or contracted, depending on the nature of the gatherings they hosted, and its towers reached toward a sky that showed different stars to each observer based on their individual relationship to hope and possibility. Within this palace ruled the royal family of the Twili, descendants of the original interlopers who had inherited both their ancestors' power and the responsibility to guide their people toward eventual redemption. The crown they bore was not a symbol of dominance but of service, marking them as the individuals who had accepted the burden of helping their entire race work through the consequences of ancient choices. The most remarkable of these rulers was Princess Midna, whose wisdom and compassion had transformed what might have been a dynasty of bitter exiles into a lineage of inspired teachers. Under her guidance, the Twili had learned to see their banishment not as punishment but as opportunity, a chance to develop forms of consciousness that would have been impossible within the limitations of ordinary physical existence. Midna herself embodied the potential that existed within every Twili heart, the possibility of transforming suffering into wisdom and isolation, into a deeper form of connection than any purely physical relationship could provide. Her understanding of both light and shadow magic exceeded even that of her ancestors, but she wielded this power with a humility that came from truly comprehending the consequences of magical hubris. Under her rule, the Twili developed arts and sciences that bore no resemblance to earthly disciplines but served similar functions in expanding understanding and improving the quality of existence. Their music was composed not of sounds but of direct emotional resonance, creating symphonies of feeling that could heal trauma and inspire growth in ways that conventional melodies could never achieve. Their literature consisted of shared dreams and collective memories, stories that were experienced rather than told, and that changed based on the consciousness of each individual who encountered them. A single Twili tale might be a comedy to one reader, a tragedy to another, and a philosophical treatise to a third, depending on what lessons they were ready to receive at the moment of encountering it. Their technology, if it could be called that, operated through principles that combined consciousness and matter in ways that earthly science could not begin to comprehend. They created devices that responded to intention rather than manipulation, tools that became extensions of their user's will, rather than separate objects that had to be controlled through external effort. The soul orbs that served as their primary source of energy were perhaps the most remarkable of these consciousness-responsive technologies. These spheres of crystallized twilight could generate illumination that revealed truth rather than mere physical details, light that showed not what was but what could be, possibility rather than limitation. Yet for all their achievements in the realm of consciousness and spirit, the Twili never forgot that they were exiles whose ultimate goal was reconciliation with the realms they had been banished from. Their entire civilization was oriented toward the gradual development of the wisdom and humility that would eventually allow them to return to normal existence without recreating the mistakes that had led to their banishment. This long-term perspective shaped every aspect of Twili society, from their educational systems that emphasized understanding over accumulation of facts to their political structures that prioritized collective growth over individual advancement. They understood that their time in the Twilight Realm was temporary, a period of learning and development that would eventually lead to reintegration with the larger community of conscious beings. The Mirror of Twilight served as both gateway and symbol of this eventual reunification, an artifact that could connect their shadow realm to the physical world, but only when used by those whose consciousness had achieved sufficient balance between light and dark impulses. The mirror was not a simple portal but a testing device that responded only to individuals who had learned to embrace both aspects of their nature without being dominated by either. Through this sacred artifact, worthy representatives of both realms could travel between dimensions, carrying messages of understanding and preparing for the eventual dissolution of the barriers that kept the realms separate. But such journeys were never undertaken lightly, for the transition between twilight and normal existence required preparations that could take decades to complete. The few surface dwellers who had been permitted to visit the Twilight Realm spoke of experiences that transcended every category their earthly vocabulary could provide. They described a world where thought and matter danced together in patterns of impossible beauty, where individual consciousness could expand to encompass entire landscapes without losing its essential identity, and where the very concept of separation revealed itself as merely another form of connection. But perhaps most profound was their encounter with Twili wisdom, the unique perspective that could only be developed by beings who had learned to exist in the spaces between absolute categories. The Twili understood paradox not as contradiction but as deeper truth, recognizing that reality was complex enough to contain elements that seemed mutually exclusive, but were actually complementary aspects of more fundamental unities. This understanding had led them to develop what they called the philosophy of perpetual balance, a way of thinking that embraced change as the only constant and sought stability not through rigid control, but through fluid adaptation to whatever circumstances arose. They had learned to find peace in uncertainty and strength in vulnerability, achievements that represented the ultimate transformation of their original shadow magic obsession into genuine wisdom. Their relationship with the light spirits who had banished them evolved over the millennia from resentment to understanding to something approaching gratitude. They came to recognize that their exile had been not an act of cruelty, but of profound compassion, a intervention that had saved them from the spiritual destruction that would have inevitably followed their successful conquest of the sacred realm. The light spirits, for their part, watched the Twili development with satisfaction and growing hope. They had always intended the banishment to be temporary, lasting only until the exiled people had learned the lessons necessary for safe reintegration with the larger community of realms. The progress the Twili had made under wise leadership like Midna's suggested that this reconciliation might be possible sooner than originally anticipated. Yet the Twilight Realm faced its own challenges and dangers, for not every inhabitant had embraced the path of wisdom and growth that their circumstances offered. Some Twili remained bitter about their exile and sought to use their shadow magic abilities not for understanding, but for revenge against the light-dwelling worlds that had cast them out. The rise of Zant represented the most serious threat to Twili society since their original banishment, an individual whose personal resentments had grown into an obsession with power that echoed the mistakes of their distant ancestors. His attempt to conquer the light world using corrupted twilight magic created chaos in both realms and threatened to undo centuries of patient progress toward reconciliation. But his ultimate defeat achieved through the cooperation of heroes from both realms, demonstrated the possibility of the unity that the wisest Twili had always envisioned. When Midna joined forces with Link to overcome the corruption that Zant had unleashed, they created a partnership that transcended the boundaries between light and shadow, proving that such boundaries were artificial constructs rather than fundamental aspects of reality. The sacrifice that Midna eventually made, breaking the mirror of twilight to preserve the peace between realms, represented the ultimate expression of Twili wisdom. By choosing to maintain their separation until both peoples had grown enough to ensure that reunion would bring harmony rather than conflict, she demonstrated the kind of long-term thinking that had transformed her people from dangerous exiles into potential bridges between different aspects of existence. Yet even that sacrifice was not final, for consciousness that has learned to transcend the artificial boundaries between light and shadow cannot be permanently contained by physical separations. The connections that had been forged between realms during their cooperation continued to exist at levels too deep for any mirror to reflect or break, ensuring that the eventual reunion would occur when the time was truly right. The Twilight Realm stands as eternal testament to the possibility of redemption, the recognition that no mistake is so serious that it cannot eventually be transformed into wisdom through patient effort and genuine humility. The Twili journey from dangerous interlopers to wise intermediaries between different aspects of existence offers hope to any consciousness that has lost its way in the shadows of its own making. In the quiet hours when day surrenders to night, and the world exists in that perfect balance between light and darkness, it becomes possible to sense something of what the Twili discovered during their long exile in the twilight spaces. The boundaries that seem so solid in the harsh light of noon, or the absolute darkness of midnight, reveal themselves as fluid transitions, opportunities for consciousness to explore new ways of being, rather than barriers that must be accepted as permanent limitations. Their greatest gift to the larger community of conscious beings may be the recognition that shadow and light are not enemies but partners in the eternal dance of existence, that true wisdom comes not from choosing one over the other, but from learning to move gracefully between them as circumstances require. In discovering how to make their home in the spaces between absolutes, the Twili proved that consciousness itself is more flexible and creative than any of its temporary dwelling places, always capable of finding new ways to express the infinite mystery of aware existence. In the hidden spaces between the visible and the invisible, where the grand dramas of kingdoms and heroes unfold unnoticed by those whose attention remains fixed on larger matters, there exists a civilization so small that most eyes would pass over it without recognition, yet so essential to the balance of all existence that without their quiet ministrations, the very fabric of reality might begin to unravel at its edges. These are the Picori, though they are known by many names throughout the scattered cultures that have glimpsed them in moments of perfect stillness and wonder. The Minish, as they are sometimes called, represent perhaps the most profound example of how significance bears no relationship to size, how the mightiest forces in the universe often work through the most humble and unassuming vessels. To understand the Picori is to abandon every assumption about the relationship between scale and importance, to recognize that the cosmos operates on principles that have nothing to do with the crude measurements that govern ordinary perception. In their microscopic realm, where a dewdrop becomes an ocean and a fallen leaf transforms into a continent, the Picori have built a civilization that surpasses in wisdom and harmony any of the grand empires whose names echo through historical records. Their origins stretch back to the very beginning of conscious existence in the mortal realm, making them perhaps the oldest continuous civilization in any dimension. They were present when the first seeds of awareness took root in primitive minds, watching over the delicate process of consciousness awakening to itself with the patient attention that only beings who measure time in eons rather than years can truly provide. The Picori understood from their earliest moments that their small stature was not a limitation but a divine gift, a form perfectly suited for the work they had been called to perform. While larger beings concerned themselves with the obvious challenges of existence, wars and politics, the rise and fall of kingdoms, the grand gestures that history would remember, the Picori dedicated themselves to the infinite collection of tiny details that actually determined whether life would flourish or fade. They became the guardians of small things, the protectors of everything that was too minor to attract the attention of more conventionally minded creatures. A single Picori might spend centuries tending to the welfare of a particular patch of moss, ensuring that it received precisely the right amount of moisture and sunlight to serve as shelter for countless even tinier creatures whose existence depended on such careful stewardship. Their cities, invisible to ordinary sight, were marvels of engineering that made the greatest architectural achievements of larger races seem crude by comparison. Built within the hollow stems of flowers, carved into the spaces between grains of sand, suspended within drops of morning dew that had been taught to maintain their perfect spherical shape through seasons and storms, these settlements represented the ultimate harmony between conscious intention and natural process. Every Picori dwelling was simultaneously a work of art, a scientific instrument, and a sacred space where the boundaries between individual consciousness and universal awareness dissolved into something that transcended both. Their architects did not impose designs upon resistant materials, but discovered the forms that already existed in potential within whatever medium they chose to work with, coaxing rather than forcing matter to reveal its hidden capacities for beauty and function. The technologies they developed operated according to principles that bore no resemblance to the mechanical approaches favored by larger civilizations. Their tools were living extensions of natural processes, devices that enhanced and directed forces that were already present in the environment, rather than imposing artificial energies from external sources. A Picori craftsman might spend decades learning to communicate with the internal structure of a grain of wood, understanding its natural tensions and possibilities so completely that shaping it became a collaborative effort between conscious intention and material willingness. The results were implements that seemed to have grown rather than been manufactured, tools that became more effective the longer they were used, and that could be passed down through generations while actually improving with age. Their understanding of time differed radically from that of surface dwellers, for whom the passage of seasons seemed to mark significant changes in the world around them. To the Picori, who could observe the complete life cycles of bacteria and witness the birth and death of countless microorganisms within what larger beings would consider a single moment, time revealed itself as a fluid medium rather than a rigid framework. This perception allowed them to work with temporal processes in ways that seemed miraculous to less patient observers. They could nurture seeds through years of careful preparation that would culminate in a single perfect moment of flowering, or guide the development of crystalline structures through decades of minute adjustments that would result in gems of impossible beauty and power. The Picori blade, which would eventually become known as the Four-Sword, through processes of transformation that reflected their deep understanding of how potential unfolds into manifestation, represented perhaps their greatest contribution to the larger world's struggle against the forces of chaos and destruction. This weapon was not forged through conventional means, but grown through centuries of careful cultivation, each fold of its metal structure representing a harmonious resolution between competing forces. The blade embodied the Picori philosophy that true strength comes not from overwhelming opposition but from understanding it so completely that conflict transforms into cooperation. When wielded by someone who had learned to think like the Picori themselves, paying attention to the smallest details, finding significance in apparently minor events, working with natural processes rather than against them, the sword became capable of dividing not just its wielder, but reality itself into multiple aspects that could address different aspects of any challenge simultaneously. Yet the creation of such an artifact was never undertaken lightly or for casual purposes. The Picori understood that weapons, no matter how wise their design, carried within them the potential for both creation and destruction. They would craft tools of power only when the need was genuine, and the wielder had demonstrated sufficient wisdom to use them in harmony with, rather than opposition to the greater good. Their relationship with the larger world was characterized by the same careful discretion that governed all their activities. They made themselves known to surface dwellers only when such contact could serve the greater balance, appearing to individuals who had demonstrated sufficient patience and humility to appreciate the profound significance of small things. Children, with their natural acceptance of wonder and their lack of preconceived notions about what was possible or impossible, were often the first to notice Picori presence. A young person who learned to sit very still and watch very carefully might glimpse tiny figures moving purposefully through grass that towered above them like forests, or catch sight of miniature boats navigating streams that to larger eyes appeared empty of all traffic. These encounters were never accidental, but represented careful selections made by Picori observers who had identified individuals with the potential to benefit from expanded perspective. A child who learned to see the world through Picori eyes would carry that vision throughout their life, finding significance and beauty in details that others would overlook, developing the kind of patient attention that could solve problems which more dramatic approaches would only complicate. The festival traditions that commemorated Picori contributions to surface civilization were themselves examples of how the smallest gestures could carry the greatest meaning. These celebrations, when they occurred at all, were marked not by grand spectacles but by quiet acts of appreciation, the careful tending of gardens, the repair of small damaged objects, the patient observation of natural processes that might otherwise go unnoticed. Participants in such festivals learned to experience time as the Picori did, discovering that slowing down enough to truly see what was happening in each moment revealed depths of beauty and complexity that normal, hurried perception missed entirely. They found that a single flower, when observed with sufficient attention, contained entire universes of color and form, while the sound of wind moving through leaves became a symphony of such intricate beauty that no human composer could hope to reproduce it. The curse that transformed the sage Eslo into his cap-like form represented one of the few occasions when Picori involvement in larger events became visible to ordinary observation. This incident, tragic though it was, demonstrated both the profound power that the Minish possessed and their equally profound restraint in exercising it. Vati's corruption and his theft of the light force created a crisis that threatened not just the surface world, but the delicate balance that allowed the Picori realm itself to exist in harmony with larger dimensional structures. The young sorcerer's obsession with power reflected the same dangerous misunderstanding that had led to catastrophes throughout history, the belief that significance could be measured in terms of size and obvious influence rather than subtle harmony and patient service. The events that followed, culminating in Link's transformation and his journey through both large and small versions of reality, provided a unique opportunity for surface dwellers to experience something of what existence felt like from Picori perspective. When the hero learned to shrink to Minish size, he discovered a world that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien, where every garden became a wilderness, and every puddle an ocean to be navigated with careful attention to currents and weather. This size-shifting magic was not simply a matter of becoming smaller, but of learning to perceive reality through different scales of attention. In his reduced form, Link could observe processes that were invisible at normal size, seeing how plants actually grew, witnessing the complex negotiations between different species of insects, understanding the intricate relationships that connected every element of the natural world in webs of mutual dependence. But perhaps more importantly, he learned to think like the Picori themselves, developing patience that could sustain attention through tasks that might take days or weeks to complete, finding satisfaction in accomplishments that would seem insignificant to those who measured success in terms of dramatic victories and obvious achievements. He discovered that solving problems often required not grand gestures, but careful observation, followed by precisely timed interventions, so small that their effects might not become apparent until much later. The foresword that emerged from these experiences was more than just a powerful weapon, but a tool that embodied Picori wisdom about the relationship between unity and diversity. When activated, it divided its wielder into multiple aspects that could work together while maintaining distinct perspectives, demonstrating how consciousness itself could be multiplied without being diminished, how individual awareness could expand to encompass multiple viewpoints simultaneously. This multiplication was not random, but followed principles that the Picori had discovered through their patient observation of how natural systems maintained both diversity and coherence. Each aspect of the divided consciousness specialized in particular kinds of attention and response, while remaining connected to the others through bonds that grew stronger rather than weaker as they were stretched across different 12 activities and locations. The success of this approach proved that the Picori understanding of reality was not limited to their tiny realm, but represented universal principles that could be applied at any scale of existence. Their patient attention to detail, their willingness to work through small adjustments rather than dramatic transformations, their recognition that every element of a system contributed to the well-being of the whole, all of these qualities could guide the actions of beings of any size who were wise enough to embrace them. Yet the Picori themselves remained largely hidden from ordinary view, continuing their essential work in the spaces between visible events, where their interventions could maintain the delicate balances that allowed more obvious activities to proceed without catastrophic interference. They understood that their greatest service to the larger world lay not in making themselves known, but in ensuring that the countless tiny processes which supported all larger phenomena continued to function with the precision and harmony that conscious intention could provide. Their cities continued to thrive in their invisible locations, their populations growing and developing new forms of wisdom, while remaining carefully hidden from those who lacked the patience and humility necessary to appreciate their contributions. They became the secret guardians of a world that remained unaware of how much it depended on their constant attention, the invisible foundation upon which all visible achievements ultimately rested. The few scholars who had glimpsed evidence of Picori civilization spoke of technologies that operated through principles no surface dweller could begin to understand, devices that could manipulate matter and energy at the molecular level with precision that exceeded anything achievable through conventional means. They described cities that existed in perfect harmony with their environments, societies that had achieved sustainable abundance without depleting any resources or creating any waste. But perhaps most remarkable was their social organization, which had somehow eliminated the conflicts and competition that seemed inevitable in larger civilizations. The Picori had discovered ways of coordinating individual efforts that enhanced rather than limited personal freedom, systems of cooperation that allowed each member of their society to develop their unique capabilities while contributing to collective projects that no individual could accomplish alone. This achievement reflected their fundamental understanding that consciousness itself was not a competitive resource that became scarce when shared, but an expanding medium that grew stronger as more beings learned to participate in its creative potential. They had learned to see individual awareness and collective wisdom not as opposing forces, but as complementary aspects of a single reality that could express itself through countless forms without ever being exhausted or diminished. In the quiet moments when attention turns away from the obvious dramas that usually capture awareness, when the eye learns to see what has always been present but overlooked, it becomes possible to sense something of the Picori presence that continues to work patiently in the spaces between larger events. Their wisdom whispers through the rustle of leaves. Their patience flows in the gradual changes that transform landscapes over decades. Their careful attention to detail manifests in the perfect timing that brings different elements together in moments of unexpected harmony. To learn to see as the Picori see is to discover that the world contains infinite depths of beauty and significance that remain invisible to hurried perception, that every moment offers opportunities for meaningful contribution that have nothing to do with grand gestures or dramatic achievements. It is to understand that the smallest acts of conscious attention can have consequences that ripple through reality for generations, creating effects that exceed anything that could be accomplished through force or obvious manipulation. Their greatest gift to any consciousness willing to receive it is the recognition that size and significance exist in inverse proportion, that the most profound influences work through the most humble means, and that patient attention to apparently minor details represents perhaps the most powerful form of service that any aware being can offer to the infinite mystery of existence itself. In the spaces where desire meets reality, where the deepest longings of conscious beings encounter the malleable substance of existence itself, there was created a realm that stands as perhaps the most profound example of how individual will can reshape the very foundations of the cosmos. This is the dark world, though that name carries connotations of evil and corruption that do not truly capture the complex nature of what emerged when one man's ambitions grew large enough to transform an entire dimension. The sacred realm had existed since the beginning of time as a perfect reflection of divine intention, a space where the Triforce rested in eternal balance and where the pure essence of power, wisdom, and courage maintained their harmonious dance without interference from mortal desires or earthly limitations. It was a place of such pristine beauty that even the gods approached it with reverence, understanding that here existed the template from which all other realities drew their patterns of meaning and possibility. Yet the sacred realm possessed a quality that was simultaneously its greatest strength and its most dangerous vulnerability. It was responsive to consciousness in ways that no earthly dimension could match, shaped not just by the intentions of those who entered it, but by the deepest truths of their nature, the hidden aspects of their being that they might not even acknowledge to themselves. When Ganondorf first set foot in that pristine space, carrying within his heart the accumulated resentments and ambitions of a lifetime spent watching his people struggle in the harsh desert, while others enjoyed the abundance of more fertile lands, the very air began to darken with the shadow of his inner landscape. The sacred realm did not judge his emotions as good or evil, but simply reflected them with perfect fidelity, transforming itself to match the reality that existed within his consciousness. The change did not happen all at once, for even the sacred realm's infinite responsiveness required time to process and manifest the full complexity of a mortal soul. At first, there were only subtle alterations, shadows that fell in slightly different patterns, colors that seemed muted compared to their original brilliance, a quality of light that suggested approaching storm rather than eternal noon. But as Ganondorf's presence continued to influence the realm, as his desires and fears, his anger and his pain, his determination to claim what he believed was rightfully his, all of these began to work their transformative magic upon the cosmic substance that surrounded him. The sacred realm began its metamorphosis into something that reflected not divine perfection but human complexity in all its tragic grandeur. The dark world that emerged was not a simple inversion of light into shadow, though superficial observation might suggest such a crude transformation. It was instead a realm where every element had been filtered through the lens of Ganondorf's particular understanding of reality, where his experiences and expectations had become the organizing principles that determined how matter and energy would behave, where the sacred realm had sparkled with crystalline waters that reflected the pure light of divine truth. The dark world contained marshes and swamps that mirrored the murky depths of mortal ambition, where pristine mountains had reached toward heaven with peaks of impossible beauty. There now stood jagged cliffs that spoke of struggle and conquest rather than peaceful contemplation. Yet, even in its transformed state, the realm retained traces of its original magnificence. For Ganondorf's soul, corrupted though it had become by years of resentment and desire for revenge, still contained echoes of the noble aspirations that had once motivated his actions. The desert prince, who had genuinely sought to improve the lives of his people, remained buried beneath layers of accumulated bitterness, and that buried nobility continued to influence the realm's transformation in ways that created pockets of unexpected beauty within the larger landscape of corruption. These untouched areas became islands of possibility within the dark world, spaces where the original sacred realm's perfection continued to shine through despite the general transformation. They served as reminders that no corruption, however complete it might appear, could entirely eliminate the divine spark that existed at the heart of all consciousness, and they offered hope that even the most profound transformations might eventually be reversed through sufficient wisdom and dedication. The creatures that inhabited this transformed realm reflected the same complex mixture of corruption and residual nobility that characterized the landscape itself. Where the sacred realm had been populated by beings of pure spiritual essence who existed in perfect harmony with divine will, the dark world contained entities that embodied various aspects of Ganondorf's psychological landscape, made manifest through the realm's reality-shaping properties. Some of these beings were clearly monstrous, reflecting the anger and hatred that had grown within him through years of watching his people suffer while others prospered. These creatures attacked without provocation and seemed to exist purely for destruction, their forms twisted into shapes that suggested violence and malice as their primary characteristics. But others retained traces of their original divine nature, transformed but not entirely corrupted, existing in states of perpetual conflict between their pure essence and the distorting influence of the realm's changed nature. These beings often displayed a tragic nobility, struggling against their own corrupted impulses while retaining enough of their original consciousness to recognize what they had lost. Most intriguing of all were the creatures that seemed to represent Ganondorf's own internal struggles made visible, entities that embodied the eternal conflict between his noble intentions and his corrupted methods. These beings often appeared to be engaged in battles with themselves, their forms shifting between beauty and monstrosity as different aspects of their dual nature gained temporary ascendancy. The magic that flowed through the dark world operated according to principles that reflected Ganondorf's understanding of power and its proper applications. Where the sacred realm's energies had moved in patterns of perfect balance and mutual support, the dark world's magical currents followed pathways that emphasized dominance and control the imposition of will upon resistant reality rather than the harmonious cooperation between consciousness and cosmic force. Yet even this corrupted magic retained echoes of its divine origins, and those who learned to approach it with sufficient wisdom could sometimes tap into currents of power that transcended the realm's generally malevolent character. The key lay in understanding that the corruption was not absolute, that beneath the surface, distortions flowed streams of pure energy that remained uncontaminated by Ganondorf's influence. The palaces and structures that dotted the Dark World landscape were perhaps the most visible manifestations of how desire had reshaped reality according to its own vision. These buildings embodied Ganondorf's conception of what power should look like when made manifest in architectural form, imposing fortresses that spoke of dominance and control, temples that celebrated strength rather than wisdom, chambers designed to intimidate rather than inspire. Yet even these structures revealed the complexity of their creator's nature, for many contained elements of surprising beauty and sophisticated design that spoke of aesthetic sensibilities that transcended mere brutality. The same consciousness that had created dungeons filled with deadly traps had also conceived spaces of genuine grandeur, halls where light and shadow danced together in patterns that achieved a kind of terrible magnificence. The relationship between the Dark World and its earthly counterpart created one of the most fascinating aspects of the realm's nature. Every location in Hyrule had its reflection in the transformed sacred realm, but these reflections were filtered through Ganondorf's perceptions and memories, creating a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien to those who knew the original. Hyrule Castle appeared as a twisted fortress of black stone and burning moats, reflecting Ganondorf's view of the royal family as oppressors who maintained their power through force and fear. The peaceful villages became ghost towns or monster-infested ruins, embodying his belief that ordinary citizens were either potential threats to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. Yet the desert regions, his own homeland, appeared in the Dark World with a beauty that surpassed even their earthly magnificence, transformed into realms of golden sand and crystal oases that reflected his genuine love for the harsh landscape that had shaped his people's character. These areas remained largely free of the corruption that affected other regions, serving as monuments to the pure aspects of his nature that had survived despite everything. The psychological implications of the Dark World's existence extended far beyond the immediate effects of Ganondorf's transformation of the sacred realm. The very fact that individual consciousness could reshape reality on such a fundamental level suggested that all realms, all dimensions, all possible worlds were far more malleable than most beings dared to imagine. This recognition carried both tremendous hope and equally tremendous responsibility, for it implied that every conscious being possessed the potential to influence reality through the quality of their inner life. The thoughts they chose to nurture, the emotions they allowed to dominate their consciousness, the values they embraced or rejected, all of these could potentially reshape not just their personal experience, but the very fabric of existence itself. The few heroes who had ventured into the Dark World and returned to tell of their experiences spoke of a realm where the normal rules that governed the relationship between mind and matter had been suspended in favor of more direct forms of interaction between consciousness and reality. Objects could be transformed through force of will. Distances could be traversed through shifts in perspective rather than physical movement. And the very nature of identity became fluid in ways that challenged every assumption about what it meant to exist as a separate individual. These visitors learned to navigate the transformed realm by developing what they called inner sight, the ability to perceive the emotional and psychological currents that determined how the Dark World's reality would respond to their presence. Those who approached with hearts full of fear and anger found themselves faced with environments that reflected and amplified these negative emotions, while those who maintained inner peace and clarity discovered that even the most corrupted areas retained pockets of beauty and safety. The Moon Pearl, that sacred artifact which allowed visitors to maintain their original forms within the reality-shifting environment of the dark world, represented more than simple magical protection. It embodied the principle that consciousness grounded in truth and self-awareness could resist even the most powerful reality-distorting forces, that individual identity rooted in genuine understanding could remain stable even when surrounded by realms where everything else was in constant flux. Those who wore the pearl learned that their protection came not from the artifact itself, but from their willingness to remain true to their essential nature, regardless of external pressures. The pearl simply made visible what was always true, that consciousness aligned with authentic being possessed an inherent stability that transcended any temporary environmental conditions. The process of the Dark World's eventual restoration remained one of the great mysteries of interdimensional magic, for the realm's transformation back to its original, sacred nature involved principles that operated beyond the normal understanding of cause and effect. Ganondorf's defeat in the earthly realm seemed to trigger corresponding changes in the dimension he had corrupted, but the mechanism by which this restoration occurred suggested connections between individual consciousness and cosmic reality that philosophers would debate for generations. Some theorists proposed that the Dark World had never truly been separate from the sacred realm, but had existed as a kind of temporary overlay that distorted perception without actually altering the underlying divine reality. According to this view, Ganondorf's influence had created a filter that changed how the realm appeared and functioned without fundamentally transforming its essential nature. Others suggested that the restoration required active participation from consciousness aligned with divine will, that the realm could only return to its original state when beings of sufficient wisdom and purity entered it with the specific intention of healing the damage that had been done. This theory implied that reality itself possessed a kind of memory that could be accessed and restored by those who understood the proper principles. Perhaps most intriguingly, a few bold thinkers proposed that the Dark World continued to exist in parallel with the restored sacred realm, that Ganondorf's transformation had actually created a permanent addition to the cosmic order rather than a temporary corruption. According to this view, the universe now contained both the original realm of divine perfection and its dark reflection, creating new possibilities for growth and understanding that had not existed before. This interpretation suggested that even corruption and evil, when viewed from a sufficiently expanded perspective, could contribute to the greater good by providing opportunities for consciousness to develop qualities like courage, wisdom, and compassion that could only emerge when faced with genuine challenges. The Dark World, in this reading, became not a tragedy to be mourned, but a cosmic gift that expanded the range of experiences available to evolving consciousness. The various versions and iterations of the Dark World that appeared in different cycles of history seem to support this interpretation, for each manifestation reflected the unique psychological landscape of whoever was responsible for its creation, while maintaining certain consistent characteristics that suggested underlying principles rather than random phenomena. Each new Dark World revealed different aspects of how consciousness could reshape reality when freed from normal constraints, providing insights into the relationship between inner states and outer manifestation that would have been impossible to discover through purely theoretical study. These realms served as laboratories where the most fundamental questions about the nature of existence could be explored through direct experience rather than abstract speculation. The lessons learned from these explorations gradually filtered into the understanding of wise beings throughout various realms, contributing to the development of magical and spiritual practices that took into account the profound connections between individual consciousness and cosmic reality. Schools of thought emerged that taught students to observe their own inner states with the kind of careful attention that astronomers devoted to celestial movements, recognizing that the quality of their consciousness could influence far more than their immediate personal circumstances. The dark world's legacy extended beyond mere academic understanding to practical applications that could benefit any being willing to accept responsibility for their inner life. The recognition that thought and emotion possessed reality-shaping power encouraged the development of mental disciplines that approach psychological health as a form of cosmic service, understanding that individual well-being contributed to universal harmony in ways that transcended personal benefits. In the quiet moments when consciousness turns inward to observe its own processes, when attention becomes still enough to perceive the subtle connections between thought and reality, it becomes possible to sense something of the profound truth that the dark world revealed through its very existence. The boundaries between inner and outer, between subjective experience and objective reality, begin to dissolve, revealing a deeper unity in which individual awareness and cosmic manifestation dance together in patterns of infinite creativity and meaning. The greatest gift of the dark world may be the recognition that reality is far more responsive to consciousness than most beings dare to believe, that the quality of awareness itself represents perhaps the most powerful force for transformation in any universe. This understanding carries both the responsibility to cultivate wisdom and compassion in one's inner life and the tremendous hope that no situation, however dark or corrupted it may appear, lies beyond the reach of consciousness aligned with truth and love, beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. In a space that exists between dream and waking consciousness, where the normal laws that govern existence bend like light passing through troubled water, there lies a realm so enigmatic that scholars have spent lifetimes debating whether it truly exists at all or represents something far more mysterious. A dimension born from the collision between individual trauma and cosmic possibility, where the deepest fears and desperate hopes of a single consciousness have somehow achieved independent existence. This is Termina, a name that carries within its syllables the weight of endings and beginnings, of cycles that complete themselves only to begin anew, of time itself, transformed from a river flowing steadily toward an ocean, into something more, resembling a whirlpool that draws everything within its influence into patterns of eternal repetition. To enter Termina is to step outside the comfortable certainties that make ordinary life bearable, and into a realm where every assumption about the nature of reality must be reconsidered from its very foundations. The origins of this parallel kingdom remain shrouded in mystery so profound that even the wisest sages can offer only theories that seem to dissolve into further questions the more closely they are examined. Some believe that Termina was created by the overwhelming grief and confusion that followed a great tragedy, emotions so powerful that they somehow carved out their own space within the fabric of existence, where they could work through their implications without disturbing the stability of normal reality. Others propose that it represents a kind of cosmic safety valve, a dimension that emerges spontaneously when the pressure of unresolved psychological forces threatens to tear holes in the careful boundaries that separate different levels of existence. According to this theory, Termina serves a necessary function in maintaining the overall balance of all realms by providing a space where the most intense and potentially destructive emotions can play out their patterns without causing permanent damage to the established order. Perhaps most intriguingly, there are those who suggest that Termina exists in the spaces between moments, in the infinitesimal gaps that separate one instant from the next in normal time. They propose that what appears to be a parallel world is actually the interior landscape of a single moment, stretched to encompass entire lifetimes of experience, a temporal pocket where consciousness can explore possibilities that would normally be compressed into fleeting thoughts or half-remembered dreams. Whatever its ultimate nature, Termina presents itself to visitors as a complete world with its own geography, its own inhabitants, and its own complex history that seems to span generations despite the realm's fundamental relationship with cyclical time. The landscape itself reflects the psychological complexity of whatever force brought it into being, with regions that embody different emotional states and spiritual conditions arranged in patterns that speak of deep symbolic meaning rather than random geographical distribution. The central area, dominated by the imposing clock town, with its massive timepiece that counts down the hours toward apocalypse, represents the heart of Termina's temporal mystery. Here, time moves with mechanical precision while simultaneously revealing its ultimate meaninglessness. For every 72-hour cycle ends not in genuine progress but in complete reset, as if the entire world were a cosmic record player that could only play the same song over and over again. The inhabitants of Clocktown go about their daily routines with the peculiar mixture of urgency and resignation that characterizes beings who exist in a state of perpetual crisis that never quite resolves itself. They rush to complete tasks and fulfill obligations, driven by the same instincts that motivate people everywhere, yet their efforts carry a quality of futility that suggests deep understanding of their situation's essential impossibility. Each citizen follows patterns that repeat with perfect precision through every cycle. Yet, these patterns are not simple mechanical repetitions, but complex performances that contain subtle variations and hidden depths. The mailman who races through his appointed rounds displays a dedication to duty that borders on the heroic, even though his letters will never truly reach their destinations in any permanent sense. The couple planning their wedding pursues their happiness with genuine emotion, despite the knowledge that their union will be repeatedly interrupted by the world's cyclical destruction. This creates a philosophical puzzle that cuts to the heart of questions about meaning and purpose in existence itself. If actions have no lasting consequences, if every choice will eventually be undone by temporal reset, what significance can individual effort possess? Yet the people of Termina continue to act as if their choices matter, continue to feel genuine emotions, and form real relationships, suggesting that meaning might exist independently of permanence. The 4 regions that surround Clocktown embody different aspects of the human condition transformed into geographical realities, each one presenting challenges and opportunities that reflect fundamental psychological and spiritual territories that all conscious beings must eventually navigate. These are not merely locations, but states of being made manifest as physical spaces where inner realities can be explored through external adventure. To the south lies the swampland, a region of decay and stagnation, where the natural process of decomposition has been corrupted into something that threatens to consume everything, rather than nurturing new growth through the recycling of old forms. The southern swamp represents depression and despair made manifest, places where the normal flow of emotional and spiritual energy has become blocked, creating pools of toxic feeling that poison everything they touch. Yet even this realm of corruption contains the seeds of its own healing. For the Deku Palace, hidden within the swamp, demonstrates that life can find ways to flourish, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The tree people who dwell there have adapted to their challenging environment, not by fighting against it, but by finding ways to work with its natural rhythms while maintaining their essential vitality and joy. The Western Mountains present a completely different challenge, a landscape of perpetual winter, where the cold has become so intense that it threatens to freeze not just the body, but the very essence of life itself. Snowhead represents the psychological state of emotional numbness, the protective shutdown that consciousness sometimes employs when overwhelmed by experiences too painful to process normally. The Goron tribe that struggles to survive in this frozen wasteland embodies the challenge of maintaining warmth and community in conditions that encourage isolation and despair. Their eventual liberation through the restoration of spring demonstrates that even the most severe emotional winters must eventually yield to the return of natural cycles, but only when approached with the proper combination of courage, persistence, and willingness to accept help from others. The ocean that stretches to the west offers yet another category of challenge, representing the vast unconscious depths where forgotten memories and suppressed emotions swim like sea creatures in waters too deep for ordinary awareness to illuminate. The Great Bay is simultaneously beautiful and terrifying, offering both the promise of exploration and discovery and the threat of being overwhelmed by forces too large and powerful for individual consciousness to comprehend or control. The Zora, who make their home in these waters, demonstrate how it is possible to navigate the depths of the unconscious without being destroyed by what one discovers there. Their musical culture suggests that harmony and rhythm can provide the stability necessary for exploring even the most turbulent psychological territories, while their ability to move freely between surface and depth offers a model for consciousness that can operate effectively at multiple levels simultaneously. Finally, the Eastern Canyon presents perhaps the most complex challenge of all, a landscape where opposing forces exist in such close proximity that conflict seems inevitable, yet cooperation remains essential for survival. Ikana Canyon represents the psychological battlefield where different aspects of the self wage war against each other, where unresolved conflicts from the past continue to drain energy from present possibilities. The undead armies that march eternally through this region embody the way that old hurts and resentments can continue to animate behavior long after the original causes have lost their relevance. Yet the canyon also contains examples of how these ancient conflicts can be resolved through understanding and compassion, transforming destructive patterns into sources of wisdom and strength. Each region's guardian deity reflects a different aspect of the divine feminine principle that governs the natural cycles of death and rebirth, protection and challenge, nurturing and testing that all consciousness must encounter in its journey toward greater understanding and capability. These goddesses are not distant abstractions but intimate presences that respond directly to the needs and efforts of those who approach them with appropriate respect and genuine intention. The mask transformations that allow visitors to navigate Tamina's challenges represent perhaps the most profound aspect of the realm's teaching about the nature of identity and consciousness itself. By donning the masks that contain the essence of departed souls, the wearer gains not just new abilities but access to entirely different ways of experiencing reality, different perspectives on what it means to exist as a conscious being. The Deku mask grants the lightness and agility that comes from releasing attachment to heavy emotions and rigid thinking patterns, allowing consciousness to bounce and flow like sap through living wood. The Goron mask provides the strength and stability that emerges when one learns to find solid ground even in the midst of overwhelming challenges, rolling through obstacles rather than being stopped by them. Most mysterious of all is the Zora mask, which offers the ability to move fluidly through the depths of experience while maintaining the capacity for surface breathing, demonstrating how consciousness can learn to operate effectively in both ordinary awareness and the deeper realms of intuition and unconscious wisdom. These transformations reveal that identity itself is far more fluid and multifaceted than ordinary experience suggests, that the boundaries between self and other, between different ways of being in the world, are much more permeable than most people realize. Through wearing the masks, visitors to Termina discover that they contain within themselves the potential for perspectives and capabilities that normally remain dormant and unexpressed. The 3-day cycle that governs all existence in Termina operates according to principles that transcend simple mechanical repetition, for each iteration of the cycle contains opportunities for different choices and alternate outcomes that can gradually accumulate into genuine transformation despite the overall pattern of reset and renewal. Time becomes not a prison but a practice space where consciousness can experiment with different approaches to life's challenges until it discovers responses that truly serve its highest development. The Song of Time that controls this cycle represents one of the most powerful magical principles ever discovered, the recognition that consciousness possesses the ability to influence temporal flow through the proper application of harmony and intention. By learning to work with rather than against the rhythm of cyclical time, visitors to Termina can accomplish things that would be impossible under normal linear conditions. The song of healing that transforms tortured souls into peaceful masks demonstrates an even more profound principle: the understanding that suffering and trauma need not be simply endured or forgotten, but can be alchemically transformed into wisdom and compassion through the proper application of love and understanding. Each mask created through this process represents not just the death of pain, but its resurrection as power that can serve healing for others. Majora's Mask itself embodies the central mystery of Termina's existence, an artifact that seems to contain within its carved features the concentrated essence of all the psychological and spiritual forces that created the realm itself. The mask represents the dangerous allure of remaining trapped in cycles of trauma and repetition, the seductive comfort of familiar pain that prevents consciousness from risking the unknown territories that genuine growth requires. Yet the mask also contains the potential for its own transcendence, for the power it wields comes ultimately from consciousness itself, and consciousness retains the capacity to reclaim that power and redirect it toward healing rather than perpetual wounding. The final confrontation with Majora reveals that even the most destructive psychological patterns are ultimately creations of awareness that can be dissolved when approached with sufficient courage, wisdom, and determination. The fierce deity transformation that becomes possible through collecting all the other masks represents the culmination of Termina's teaching about the true nature of spiritual power. This divine warrior form embodies not the crude domination that lesser beings mistake for strength, but the perfect balance of all psychological and spiritual forces working in harmony toward the protection and nurturing of life in all its Baeri manifestations. The deity's fierce appearance reflects not cruelty or anger, but the absolute commitment to truth and justice that becomes possible when consciousness has learned to transcend personal limitations and identify completely with universal principles. This transformation demonstrates that the ultimate goal of spiritual development is not the elimination of power, but its purification and proper direction. The theories surrounding Termina's relationship to other realms and dimensions continue to evolve as more evidence emerges from the few individuals who have successfully navigated its mysteries and return to share their insights. Some propose that every consciousness contains its own potential termina, a psychological space where unresolved issues and unfulfilled possibilities exist in a state of suspended animation until they can be properly addressed and integrated. Others suggest that Termina represents a kind of cosmic recycling center where experiences too intense or too important to simply discard can be processed and refined until they yield whatever wisdom or power they contain. According to this theory, the realm serves the entire universe by providing a space where even the most traumatic events can eventually be transformed into resources for healing and growth. Perhaps most intriguingly, some theorists propose that Termina exists simultaneously in all times and places, that every moment of crisis or transformation in ordinary reality creates temporary doorways into this parallel realm where the work of psychological and spiritual alchemy can proceed under optimal conditions. They suggest that what appears to be a single, unique dimension is actually a universal principle made visible, the eternal process by which consciousness transforms suffering into wisdom. The few visitors who have spent significant time in Termina and managed to retain clear memories of their experiences report that the realm gradually reveals itself to be far larger and more complex than initial exploration suggests. Beyond the four primary regions lie other territories that embody even more subtle and specialized psychological states, places where consciousness can explore aspects of itself that normally remain completely unconscious. These deeper regions of Termina apparently operate according to principles that transcend not just normal geography, but normal categories of experience altogether. Visitors speak of landscapes that exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, of encounters with beings that embody abstract concepts rather than recognizable forms, of learning processes that bypass rational understanding entirely and work directly with the fundamental patterns that shape awareness itself. The music that permeates every aspect of Termina's existence provides perhaps the most important clue to understanding the realm's ultimate nature and purpose. Every location, every character, every significant event resonates with melodies that seem to emerge from the very structure of reality itself, rather than being imposed from external sources. This omnipresent music suggests that Termina operates according to harmonic principles, that its entire existence represents an extended musical composition in which every element serves both its own individual purpose and its role in the larger symphony. The songs that visitors learn to play become not just magical tools, but ways of participating in this cosmic music, of adding their own voices to the eternal composition that creates and sustains the realm itself. In the quiet hours when the boundary between sleep and waking becomes fluid, when consciousness drifts in the liminal space where dreams take on the weight of reality and memories blend with imagination, it becomes possible to sense something of Termina's presence hovering just beyond the edge of ordinary awareness. The realm calls to any consciousness that has experienced the kind of loss or trauma that cannot be resolved through normal means, offering not escape from pain but the opportunity to transform it into something that serves life rather than hindering it. The greatest gift that Termina offers to any being brave enough to accept its challenges is the recognition that time itself need not be experienced as a prison that traps consciousness in patterns of suffering and limitation. Through learning to work with cyclical rather than linear time, through discovering how to use repetition as a tool for refinement, rather than a trap that prevents growth, awareness can free itself from the past without losing the wisdom that experience provides. The realm stands as eternal testament to the truth that no situation, however dark or hopeless it may appear, lies beyond the reach of consciousness committed to transformation and healing. In its endless cycles of destruction and renewal, in its demonstration that even the most traumatic experiences can become sources of power and wisdom, Termina reveals the infinite creativity and resilience that exist at the heart of aware existence itself. Beneath the endless expanse of waters that stretch from horizon to horizon in all directions, where sunlight filters down through layers of blue and green that grow darker with each fathom of descent, There lies a kingdom that challenges every assumption about the relationship between endings and beginnings, between destruction and preservation, between the finality of death and the persistence of memory made manifest in forms that defy ordinary understanding. This is the submerged realm of Hyrule, a civilization that experienced perhaps the most profound transformation in the recorded history of any kingdom, yet somehow managed to preserve its essential spirit even while surrendering its physical form to the eternal embrace of the sea. To comprehend this underwater mystery is to grapple with questions that touch the very heart of what it means for a culture, a people, a way of life to truly endure when stripped of all the material foundations that most consider essential to organized existence. The great flood that created this aquatic realm was not a natural disaster in any conventional sense, though its effects upon the physical world were certainly catastrophic by any measure that counts. Buildings destroyed, lives displaced, and landscapes transformed beyond all recognition. This was instead a conscious act of divine intervention, a deliberate choice made by powers that possessed the authority to reshape reality itself when circumstances demanded solutions that transcended ordinary possibilities. The decision to flood the world emerged from a crisis that threatened not just the immediate safety of Hyrule's people, but the very continuation of the cosmic balance that allowed good and evil to exist in productive tension rather than destructive dominance. When Ganon returned from whatever prison had contained him, when his power had grown beyond the ability of conventional heroes to contain, when the ancient cycle of challenge and response seemed on the verge of breaking down completely, the gods themselves were forced to intervene in ways they had hoped would never become necessary. The flood they unleashed was simultaneously an act of destruction and preservation. For while it eliminated the physical kingdom that had grown corrupted beyond redemption, it also created the conditions necessary for the essential spirit of Hyrulean civilization to continue in forms that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. The waters that covered the land served not just as barrier against evil, but as medium through which new possibilities for cultural evolution could emerge. King Daphnis Nohansen Hyrule, the monarch who presided over this unprecedented transformation, embodied the kind of wisdom and sacrifice that such extreme circumstances demanded. His decision to remain behind when the waters rose, to accept personal dissolution in service of his people's future, represented perhaps the ultimate expression of royal responsibility carried to its logical conclusion. The king's final moments, as he stood on the deck of his ship watching the waves close over the last remnants of his terrestrial kingdom, were marked not by despair, but by a profound sense of completion and hope. He had seen his people safely transported to new lands, where they could continue their development without the constant threat of ancient evils, and he had ensured that the submerged kingdom would remain a sanctuary where the deepest truths of Hyrulean culture could be preserved for future generations to rediscover. His transformation into a spiritual guardian of the underwater realm reflected the principle that consciousness truly dedicated to service can transcend the normal limitations of individual existence without losing its essential identity or purpose. The king became something more than he had been while remaining fundamentally himself, a protector whose influence could extend throughout the entire submerged kingdom while maintaining the personal connection to his people that had characterized his earthly reign. The process by which Hyrulean society adapted to its new underwater existence revealed capabilities for transformation and resilience that few civilizations have ever been called upon to demonstrate. The transition from air breathing to aquatic life required not just physical adaptation, but complete reconceptualization of how culture and community could function under entirely different environmental conditions. The Koroks, who had once been forest children, found their forms naturally suited to the floating life that the floodwaters made necessary. their lightweight bodies and natural buoyancy allowing them to thrive in conditions that would have been challenging for more conventionally substantial beings. Their transformation from woodland guardians to oceanic nurturers demonstrated how consciousness could maintain its essential purpose while adapting its methods to radically changed circumstances. These peaceful plant beings became the living links between the submerged kingdom and the surface world that emerged above it, carrying seeds and memories between the two realms, while serving as witnesses to the continuity that connected old and new forms of Hyrulean existence. Their ability to perceive both the visible world of wind and weather and the hidden realm of underwater preservation made them invaluable guides for anyone seeking to understand how past and present could coexist in the same geographical space. The architectural marvels that lay preserved beneath the waves represented more than simple monuments to vanished grandeur, for the submerged structures maintained their functionality in ways that conventional engineering principles suggested should have been impossible. Hyrule Castle, resting on the ocean floor yet somehow maintaining chambers filled with breathable air, demonstrated that the flood had operated according to magical rather than purely physical principles. These underwater palaces and temples served as more than mere museums, preserving artifacts of a bygone era. They functioned as active centers of spiritual and cultural activity, where the essential ceremonies and practices of Hyrulean civilization continued to be performed by guardians whose dedication transcended the normal boundaries between life and death, presence and absence, physical and spiritual existence. The Master Sword's resting place within the submerged castle created a particularly powerful focal point where the realm's preserved energies concentrated with sufficient intensity to maintain spaces of normal existence within the aquatic environment. The blade's presence served as anchor point for reality itself, ensuring that certain essential functions of the kingdom could continue despite the radical transformation of its physical circumstances. Visitors who managed to penetrate these underwater chambers reported experiences that defied every category their surface-dwelling minds possessed for understanding the relationship between past and present. They found themselves moving through spaces that existed simultaneously in multiple time periods, where the memories preserved in ancient stones had achieved sufficient concentration to create areas of living history that could be directly experienced rather than merely studied. The ghostly figures that inhabited these submerged realms were not simple phantoms or echoes of departed souls, but complex beings that embodied the continuation of cultural roles and responsibilities across the boundary between physical and spiritual existence. The guards who still patrolled ancient corridors, the servants who maintained chambers that no living person currently occupied, the courtiers who continued debates that had begun centuries earlier, all represented aspects of Hyrulean society that had achieved a form of persistence that transcended normal concepts of life and death. These beings served as both protectors of preserved knowledge and teachers for any surface dwellers who approached the underwater kingdom with appropriate respect and genuine desire to learn. They could share insights about governance, philosophy, and spiritual practice that had been refined through centuries of contemplation, uninterrupted by the normal distractions of material existence. The magic that permeated the submerged kingdom operated according to principles that combined the fluidity of water with the permanence of crystallized memory, creating effects that seemed to violate every law governing how supernatural forces normally manifested in the physical world. Spells cast in these underwater chambers possessed a stability and persistence that land-based magic could rarely achieve, while rituals performed in the presence of concentrated cultural memory gained power that far exceeded what their individual components should have been able to generate. The treasure chambers hidden throughout the underwater realm contained more than simple accumulations of gold and jewels, though these material riches were certainly present in quantities that reflected the accumulated prosperity of many generations. The true treasures were the preserved examples of Hyrulean craftsmanship, art, and technological innovation that demonstrated the heights of achievement possible when an entire culture dedicated itself to the pursuit of beauty, wisdom, and harmony. These artifacts served as more than historical curiosities, for many retained the magical properties that had been imbued into them by their original creators. Swords that could cut through any material, shields that could deflect even magical attacks, instruments that could produce music with supernatural effects on listeners, all remained as functional as they had been on the day they were first completed, preserved by the same forces that maintained the underwater kingdom itself. The relationship between the submerged realm and the surface world that developed above it created one of the most complex and fascinating examples of parallel evolution in cultural history. The descendants of those who had been evacuated before the flood gradually developed new forms of civilization adapted to their oceanic environment, while the underwater kingdom continued to preserve and refine the cultural traditions that had been established during the terrestrial period. These two branches of Hyrulean development maintained contact through various means, creating a dialogue between tradition and innovation that enriched both realms while preventing either from becoming isolated or stagnant. The surface dwellers gained wisdom and guidance from the preserved knowledge of their ancestors, while the underwater guardians received fresh perspectives and new energy from contact with actively evolving communities. The navigation techniques that allowed surface dwellers to locate and safely visit the submerged kingdom represented achievements in magical cartography that exceeded anything accomplished during the terrestrial period. These methods required not just knowledge of ocean currents and underwater geography, but understanding of how memory and intention could be used to create pathways through waters that normally bore no landmarks or reliable reference points. The few master navigators who possessed these skills spoke of following currents that were emotional rather than physical, using instruments that responded to hope and purpose rather than magnetic fields or celestial positions. They learned to read the ocean itself as a text written in the language of collective memory, where each wave and current carried information about the preserved kingdom that lay hidden beneath the surface. The ceremonies that marked successful journeys to the underwater realm were necessarily different from any celebrations that had been possible during the terrestrial period, for they required acknowledgement of the unique relationship between past and present, preservation and transformation, individual achievement and collective inheritance that characterize contact between the two levels of existence. These rituals served multiple functions simultaneously, honoring both the courage required to undertake such dangerous journeys and the wisdom preserved by those who had chosen to remain behind as guardians. They created moments of communion between surface and depth that temporarily dissolved the boundaries separating the living from the preserved, allowing participants to experience directly the continuity that connected all phases of Hyrulean development. The philosophical implications of the submerged kingdom's existence extended far beyond questions of historical preservation or cultural continuity, touching fundamental issues about the nature of identity, permanence, and the relationship between consciousness and its material expressions. The realm demonstrated that civilizations, like individuals, possessed aspects that could survive the most radical transformations, while maintaining enough continuity to remain recognizably themselves. This recognition challenged conventional assumptions about what constituted death or ending, suggesting instead that such concepts might represent transitions between different modes of existence rather than absolute terminations. The underwater kingdom stood as proof that communities of consciousness could persist through changes that seemed to eliminate every foundation upon which their identity had been built. The ecological relationships that developed within the submerged realm created new forms of symbiosis between preserved human culture and aquatic life forms that had never before encountered such concentrated examples of conscious intention made manifest in architectural and artistic forms. Fish and sea plants gradually adapted to living among structures designed for air-breathing beings, while the magical energies that maintained the kingdom's functionality created environmental conditions that supported hybrid forms of existence. These underwater gardens where terrestrial plants learned to thrive in aquatic conditions while sea vegetation developed responses to the cultural resonances preserved in ancient stones represented living examples of how adaptation could transcend normal biological limitations when consciousness and nature worked together toward common goals. The music that echoed through the submerged halls carried melodies that had been refined through centuries of performance in acoustic conditions, unlike anything available on land or sea surface. The water itself became part of the instrumental arrangement, its currents and pressures creating harmonic variations that added layers of complexity impossible to achieve in air-based environments. These underwater symphonies serve not just as entertainment but as active forces for maintaining the magical conditions necessary to preserve the kingdom's continued existence. The music carried information and energy through the entire realm, coordinating the activities of its various guardians while maintaining the resonance patterns that kept architecture stable and atmosphere breathable within designated chambers. The few surface musicians who had been privileged to hear these performances spoke of experiences that transcended normal categories of aesthetic appreciation, describing encounters with sound that seemed to emerge from the deepest levels of reality itself, rather than from conventional instruments played by recognizable performers. They learned that music preserved in such concentrated cultural memory could achieve effects that fresh compositions could rarely match, carrying within their melodies the accumulated wisdom and emotion of entire civilizations. The eventual establishment of New Hyrule in distant lands represented not an abandonment of the underwater realm but an expansion of Hyrulean civilization into multiple dimensions of existence that could maintain contact and mutual support across vast distances and different environmental conditions. The Surface Kingdom and its submerged counterpart became complementary aspects of a single culture that had learned to exist simultaneously in multiple forms. This achievement demonstrated possibilities for cultural evolution that exceeded anything previously imagined, showing how communities of consciousness could transcend normal limitations of space and time while maintaining the essential connections that made them coherent and purposeful rather than merely scattered fragments of former unity. The spirit tracks that eventually connected various settlements in New Hyrule operated according to principles that seemed to echo the magical transportation systems that had been developed for travel to and from the submerged kingdom, suggesting deep connections between different phases of Hyrulean magical development that transcended simple chronological sequence. These rail lines that appeared and disappeared according to spiritual rather than mechanical principles demonstrated how consciousness could learn to create infrastructure that served not just immediate practical needs but long-term cultural development across multiple generations and environmental conditions. In the depths where sunlight fades to memory and pressure creates silence that speaks more eloquently than any sound, the submerged kingdom continues its patient work of preservation and transformation, maintaining treasures of wisdom and beauty that await rediscovery by future generations, ready to appreciate their significance. The underwater realm stands as eternal testament to the truth that no flood, however complete, can wash away the essential achievements of consciousness committed to truth, beauty, and service to the greater good. The greatest gift of the submerged kingdom may be its demonstration that endings and beginnings are not opposite forces, but complementary aspects of the same creative process that allows consciousness to explore infinite possibilities for growth and expression. In learning to exist simultaneously above and below the surface of ordinary reality, Hyrulean civilization proved that true cultural achievement transcends any single form of manifestation, remaining available to inspire and guide new developments, regardless of how completely the original conditions may have changed. In the mists of time before history learned to distinguish between legend and fact, when the boundaries between light and shadow existed as suggestions rather than absolute laws, there occurred a conflict so profound that its consequences would shape the fundamental structure of reality itself for all the ages that followed. This was the Interloper War, a struggle that began as a dispute over the proper use of magical knowledge, but grew into something far more significant, a cosmic battle that would determine whether consciousness could safely explore the full spectrum of its own possibilities or whether certain territories of awareness must remain forever forbidden to mortal understanding. The origins of this ancient conflict stretch back to an era when magic flowed through the world like sunlight through clear water, available to any consciousness sufficiently developed to perceive and direct its currents. In those days, the various tribes and peoples who inhabited the lands that would eventually become Hyrule possessed different approaches to the mystical arts, each culture developing techniques and philosophies that reflected their unique understanding of the relationship between individual will and cosmic force. Among these diverse magical traditions, there emerged a group of practitioners whose investigations had led them into territories that other cultures avoided through a combination of wisdom and instinctive caution. These were the shadow magic specialists, individuals who had chosen to explore the darker aspects of consciousness, not out of any inherent evil, but from the same intellectual curiosity that drives all genuine seekers to push beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. Shadow magic itself was not originally conceived as an evil art, despite what later generations would believe after witnessing its corrupted applications. In its pure form, it represented simply another facet of the cosmic spectrum, the necessary counterbalance to light magic that allowed for the existence of depth, mystery, and the kind of transformative change that could only occur when established forms were dissolved to make way for new possibilities. The practitioners who dedicated themselves to mastering this difficult discipline were often individuals of exceptional intelligence and spiritual sensitivity, drawn to shadow magic precisely because it offered insights into aspects of existence that more conventional approaches could never reach. They understood that consciousness contained within itself both creative and destructive potentials, and they believed that true wisdom required familiarity with all aspects of their own nature rather than comfortable ignorance about the darker territories of the psyche. Their studies led them to discoveries that exceeded even their own expectations about what was possible when consciousness learned to work with rather than against the forces of dissolution and transformation. They developed techniques for manipulating matter at the molecular level, by convincing it to remember previous configurations, for healing psychological trauma, by helping damaged memories dissolve back into the undifferentiated potential from which they had originally emerged, and for accessing information that existed in the spaces between thoughts where ordinary awareness could never penetrate. But perhaps most significantly, they learned to perceive the light spirits themselves, those ancient guardians whose existence had been unsuspected by practitioners of conventional magic. These beings, they discovered, served as cosmic regulators who maintained the boundaries between different levels of reality, ensuring that the forces unleashed by magical practice remained within parameters that would not threaten the stability of the overall cosmic order. The shadow magic practitioners initially approached these light spirits with the same respectful curiosity they brought to all their investigations, seeking to understand the principles that govern their operations and to learn how their own magical work could be conducted in harmony with, rather than opposition to, these cosmic maintenance systems. They had no intention of challenging or threatening the light spirits, merely of expanding their own understanding of how all the various forces of existence work together to maintain the delicate balance that allowed conscious beings to explore their potentials safely. However, the discoveries they made during these initial contacts revealed disturbing implications about the nature of the cosmic order itself. The light spirits, they learned, maintained their regulatory functions not through simple mechanical processes, but through active intervention in the development of consciousness, subtly influencing the direction of magical research to ensure that certain discoveries were never made and certain capabilities were never developed by mortal beings. This revelation created a profound crisis within the ranks of the shadow magic practitioners, for it suggested that their entire approach to learning was being manipulated by forces they had never consented to serve. The knowledge they thought they were discovering through their own efforts was actually being carefully filtered to exclude information that the light spirits deemed too dangerous for mortal consciousness to possess. Some among their number accepted this limitation as a necessary safeguard, recognizing that there might indeed be forms of knowledge so powerful that their premature discovery could threaten the stability of existence itself. They argued for continued cooperation with the light spirits, working within whatever boundaries these cosmic guardians deemed appropriate, while gradually earning greater trust and expanded access through demonstrated wisdom and restraint. But others found this revelation deeply disturbing, interpreting it as evidence that consciousness itself was being held in a state of artificial limitation that prevented it from achieving its full potential. They began to see the light spirits not as benevolent guardians, but as cosmic censors whose interventions kept all conscious beings in a state of perpetual spiritual childhood, denied access to the knowledge and capabilities that were their natural birthright. This philosophical division gradually hardened into factional conflict as the shadow magic community struggled to determine how they should respond to the discovery of their regulated status. The debate that ensued touched fundamental questions about the nature of freedom, wisdom, and the relationship between individual development and collective security that had no easy answers and perhaps no right answers at all. The faction that eventually became known as the Interlopers, though they certainly did not choose that name for themselves, consisted primarily of individuals who could not accept what they viewed as illegitimate restrictions on the natural development of consciousness. They argued that if magical knowledge was inherently dangerous, the appropriate response was to develop greater wisdom and stronger safeguards, rather than to simply forbid investigation altogether. Their leader, whose name has been lost to history, but whose influence would be felt across countless generations, was apparently an individual of extraordinary charisma and intellectual brilliance who had achieved levels of magical mastery that exceeded anything previously attained by mortal practitioners. Under this individual's guidance, the faction began developing new techniques specifically designed to circumvent the subtle influence of the light spirits and access the forbidden territories of knowledge directly. These efforts required innovations in magical theory and practice that pushed the boundaries of what shadow magic could accomplish, forcing the practitioners to develop ever more sophisticated understanding of how consciousness could interact with the fundamental forces of reality. They created new forms of protective ritual that could shield their investigations from external interference, developed group working methods that allowed multiple consciousnesses to combine their efforts while maintaining individual integrity, and discovered ways of accessing information that existed in dimensions beyond the normal reach of light spirit influence. The success of these innovations was both exhilarating and terrifying, for they revealed that the restrictions imposed by the light spirits had indeed been concealing knowledge of extraordinary power and significance. The interlopers found themselves gaining access to principles of reality manipulation that exceeded their wildest theoretical speculations, capabilities that seemed to approach the level of divine rather than merely mortal magic. But with each new discovery, each breakthrough into previously forbidden territory, they also encountered evidence that the light spirit's caution might have been justified. The forces they were learning to manipulate possessed destructive potentials that exceeded anything they had previously imagined, while the psychological pressures involved in handling such power began to create changes in their consciousness that were not entirely beneficial. The most ambitious members of the faction began to develop what could only be described as delusions of cosmic significance, convinced that their discoveries made them equal to or superior to the divine forces that had originally established the cosmic order. They started to speak of their mission not just as expanding the boundaries of mortal knowledge, but as liberating consciousness itself from what they viewed as tyrannical restrictions imposed by entities whose own legitimacy they increasingly questioned. This escalation from academic investigation to revolutionary ideology created the conditions that would eventually lead to open conflict with the light spirits, for the cosmic guardians could not ignore activities that threatened to destabilize the very foundations upon which all existence depended. The interlopers' increasingly aggressive approach to magical experimentation was creating ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate area of operations, disturbing balances that had been carefully maintained since the beginning of time. The light spirits attempted to resolve the situation through diplomatic means, manifesting in forms that could communicate directly with the interloper leadership, while explaining the cosmic principles that made their current course of action ultimately self-destructive. These entities possessed perspectives that encompassed eons of experience maintaining cosmic stability, and they tried to share enough of this understanding to help the interlopers appreciate why certain boundaries existed and why violating them would ultimately harm the very consciousness the faction claimed to be trying to liberate. But the interlopers had progressed too far in their conviction that any external limitation on their activities represented illegitimate interference with their natural rights as conscious beings. They interpreted the light spirit's diplomatic overtures as attempts at manipulation and control rather than genuine offers of guidance and cooperation, while their increasingly sophisticated magical capabilities made them confident that they could overcome any resistance the cosmic guardians might offer. The breakdown of diplomatic contact marked the beginning of the actual interloper war, though the conflict that followed bore little resemblance to conventional warfare as most cultures would understand it. This was a battle fought primarily in dimensions beyond normal physical space, where the weapons were competing theories of reality, and the battlefield was the fundamental structure of existence itself. The interlopers had developed magical techniques that allowed them to operate in multiple dimensions simultaneously, creating zones of altered reality where their enhanced capabilities could be fully utilized without interference from normal physical laws. Within these dimensional pockets, they built fortresses that existed partially outside normal space-time, laboratories where they could conduct experiments that would have been impossible under ordinary conditions, and training grounds where new practitioners could be prepared for the escalating conflict. The light spirits responded by activating defensive systems that had been built into the cosmic order from its very beginning, protocols designed to contain precisely this kind of threat to universal stability. These systems operated through principles that exceeded anything the interlopers had encountered in their previous research, demonstrating levels of integrated magical technology that made even their most advanced achievements seem primitive by comparison. The battle that ensued was fought simultaneously on multiple levels of reality, with each side utilizing capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what magical conflict could encompass. The interlopers employed techniques that could reshape local space-time to create tactical advantages, while the light spirits deployed energies that could neutralize shadow magic at its source by restoring the original cosmic balances from which it derived its power. Neither side possessed sufficient advantage to achieve rapid victory, creating a protracted conflict that threatened to tear holes in the fabric of reality itself. As the competing magical forces clashed with ever-increasing intensity, the consequences of their battle began to manifest as distortions in the normal flow of time, disruptions in the boundaries between different dimensions, and instabilities in the basic physical laws that governed material existence. It became clear that continued escalation would eventually result in damage to the cosmic order so severe that all conscious existence might be threatened, regardless of which side ultimately proved victorious. The light spirits faced the terrible responsibility of ending the conflict through whatever means necessary, even if those means involved actions they would normally consider unacceptably extreme. The solution they eventually implemented reflected both profound wisdom and genuine compassion. For rather than simply destroying the interlopers and accepting the cosmic damage such destruction would cause, they chose to transform the conflict itself into an opportunity for eventual healing and growth. They created an entirely new dimension where the shadow magic practitioners could continue their existence while being isolated from the rest of reality until they had developed sufficient wisdom to rejoin the cosmic community safely. The Twilight Realm that emerged from this creative solution was designed to serve as both prison and school, a space where the interlopers could experience the full consequences of their magical theories without endangering other forms of consciousness, while gradually learning the lessons necessary for eventual redemption and reintegration. The transformation of the interlopers into the Twili represented one of the most complex magical operations ever attempted, requiring the light spirits to alter the very nature of consciousness itself while preserving enough continuity to ensure that the transformed beings retained their essential identities and the capacity for eventual growth. The shadow magic practitioners became living embodiments of the twilight state between light and darkness, capable of existing in the spaces between absolute categories, while slowly developing the wisdom necessary to balance opposing forces, rather than choosing one over the other. This resolution of the interloper war established principles that would govern the relationship between light and shadow magic for all subsequent ages, creating frameworks for understanding how these complementary forces could work together constructively rather than destructively. The conflict had demonstrated that neither pure light nor pure shadow could provide complete solutions to the challenges of conscious existence, that true wisdom required integration of both aspects rather than domination of one by the other. The fused shadows that remained as artifacts from this ancient conflict served as reminders of what could be accomplished when shadow magic was developed to its full potential, but also as warnings about the dangers that arose when such power was pursued without appropriate wisdom and restraint. These relics retained enough of their original capabilities to be useful tools for those who approached them with proper understanding, while remaining sufficiently dangerous to destroy anyone who tried to use them for purposes that violated the cosmic balances their creation had disrupted. The light spirits themselves were transformed by their experience of the war, developing new appreciation for the legitimate needs and desires that had motivated the interlopers' rebellion. while also gaining deeper understanding of how cosmic order could accommodate individual freedom without sacrificing universal stability. They became more active in providing guidance to magical practitioners, offering ways for consciousness to explore its full potential within frameworks that served both personal development and collective well-being. The hidden history of this ancient conflict continued to influence the development of magical knowledge throughout all subsequent ages, though most practitioners remained unaware of the specific events that had shaped the principles they inherited. The careful balances that governed the relationship between different schools of magic, the subtle safeguards that prevented individual practitioners from developing capabilities that exceeded their wisdom, the complex protocols that allowed innovation while preserving stability. All of these reflected lessons learned from the Interloper War and the creative solutions the light spirits had developed for resolving seemingly irreconcilable conflicts. In the quiet hours when shadows grow long and the boundary between day and night becomes a gentle transition rather than an abrupt change, it becomes possible to sense something of the profound transformation that emerged from this ancient struggle between order and freedom, authority and innovation, collective security and individual development. The war that could have destroyed the foundations of existence instead became the catalyst for evolutionary developments that enhanced both the stability of the cosmic order and the opportunities available to conscious beings seeking to explore their full potential. The greatest legacy of the Interloper War may be the recognition that conflict itself, when approached with sufficient wisdom and creativity, can become a force for growth and integration rather than simple destruction. The light spirits and the shadow magic practitioners discovered through their struggle that apparent oppositions often conceal deeper complementarities, that forces which seemed incompatible could actually work together to create possibilities that neither could achieve alone. As we stand at the threshold between all the mysteries we have explored and the infinite questions that remain forever beyond the reach of definitive answers, there emerges a pattern that transcends any single lost kingdom or vanished civilization, a cosmic rhythm that connects every tale of rise and fall, creation and dissolution, remembrance and forgetting into something, approaching a universal principle that governs not just the history of Hyrule, but the fundamental nature of conscious existence itself. The cycle of kingdoms rises like a great breathing, an eternal inhalation and exhalation that draws consciousness through experiences of manifestation and transcendence, embodiment and liberation, building and releasing that seem to follow laws as immutable as those governing the movement of celestial bodies through their ordained paths across the star-scattered darkness of infinite space. Each lost realm we have encountered in our journey through these forgotten territories represents not merely a historical curiosity or tragic example of impermanence, but a necessary phase in the ongoing education of awareness itself, a curriculum designed by forces whose understanding encompasses perspectives that individual consciousness can only glimpse in moments of extraordinary clarity or profound surrender to the greater patterns that shape all existence. The Zonai, those architects of heaven who learned to transcend the boundaries between matter and spirit until they dissolved into something more fundamental than either, demonstrated that consciousness could evolve beyond the need for fixed form while maintaining its essential nature as creative intelligence, exploring infinite possibilities. Their spiral patterns continue to echo through every realm that followed, reminders that all development moves not in straight lines toward predetermined goals, but in expanding helixes that revisit familiar territories from ever higher perspectives. The sky kingdoms that floated above earthbound concerns showed how awareness could literally rise above the gravitational pull of material limitations, creating spaces where different rules applied and different possibilities could be explored. Yet these aerial realms were never meant to serve as permanent escapes from terrestrial challenges, but as demonstration spaces where consciousness could experience its own weightless nature before returning to ground-level existence. With expanded understanding of what was truly possible, the Twilight Realm revealed that even banishment and exile could become opportunities for development that exceeded anything achievable under normal conditions, that the spaces between absolute categories often contained the richest territories for growth and discovery. The Twili transformation from dangerous interlopers to wise intermediaries proved that no mistake was so severe that it could not eventually be transformed into wisdom through sufficient patience and genuine dedication to learning. The Picori taught the profound lesson that significance bears no relationship to scale, that the mightiest forces often work through the most humble means, and that attention to apparently minor details represents perhaps the most powerful form of service any consciousness can offer to the infinite mystery of existence. Their microscopic civilization achieved harmony and abundance that exceeded the accomplishments of empires whose names echo through historical records. The Dark World demonstrated how individual consciousness could reshape reality itself when freed from normal constraints, while simultaneously warning of the dangers that arose when such power was exercised without sufficient wisdom and moral development. It showed that desire, when allowed to operate without the tempering influence of compassion and understanding, could transform even divine perfection into landscapes of suffering and confusion. Tamina offered the most complex teaching of all, revealing how consciousness could learn to work with cyclical rather than linear time, how repetition could become a tool for refinement rather than a trap that prevented growth, and how even the most traumatic experiences could be transformed into sources of wisdom and power through the proper application of love and understanding to the raw materials of suffering. The submerged kingdom proved that no flood, however complete, could wash away the essential achievements of consciousness committed to truth and beauty, that cultures could maintain their deepest values and purposes even when stripped of all material foundations, and that endings and beginnings were complementary aspects of the same creative process rather than opposing forces. The Interloper War illustrated how apparent conflicts between order and freedom, authority and innovation, collective security and individual development could become catalysts for evolutionary developments that enhanced both sides rather than requiring the victory of one over the other. It demonstrated that consciousness possessed sufficient creativity to discover solutions that transcended the limitations of either-or thinking. Looking across all these examples, patterns emerge that suggest principles operating at levels far deeper than the specific histories of particular kingdoms or the individual choices of their inhabitants. These are laws that govern the relationship between consciousness and manifestation itself. Principles that determine how awareness explores its own infinite potential through the cyclical process of creating forms, inhabiting them fully, learning everything they have to teach, and then releasing them to make way for new experiments in being. The goddess Hylia herself appears not as a distant deity imposing arbitrary rules upon reluctant subjects, but as the animating intelligence that guides this eternal educational process, ensuring that each phase of development provides exactly the experiences necessary for consciousness to discover aspects of itself that could never be revealed through purely theoretical study. Her interventions in the various kingdoms' histories always serve the long-term goal of expanding awareness rather than short-term comfort or conventional success. The recurring patterns of heroic intervention, divine assistance, and ultimate transcendence that appear in every kingdom story reflect not accidental similarities, but fundamental structures in the relationship between individual consciousness and universal intelligence. The hero represents that aspect of awareness that maintains courage and determination even when faced with seemingly impossible challenges, while the princess embodies wisdom and spiritual power that can transform conflict into harmony through understanding rather than force. The cyclical nature of these stories, with their themes of corruption and redemption, fall and restoration, forgetting and remembrance, mirrors the natural rhythms that govern all conscious development. Just as individual beings must repeatedly face similar challenges at deeper levels as they mature, kingdoms and civilizations must work through fundamental tensions between competing values and purposes until they discover forms of organization that honor all necessary aspects of existence rather than arbitrarily privileging some over others. The role of memory in these cycles proves particularly significant, for it is often the loss of connection to deeper wisdom that allows corruption to take hold, while restoration typically requires the recovery of knowledge that had been forgotten rather than the discovery of entirely new information. This suggests that consciousness contains within itself all the understanding necessary for its own development, but that this inner wisdom must be repeatedly rediscovered through experience rather than simply inherited through instruction. The various forms of magic that appear throughout these kingdom stories represent different approaches to the fundamental relationship between individual will and cosmic force, different ways of understanding how consciousness can participate in the creative processes that shape reality. Shadow magic, light magic, elemental manipulation, time control, dimensional travel, all are techniques for exploring the malleability of existence and the creative potential that lies dormant within awareness itself. The dangers that arise when magical knowledge is pursued without corresponding development in wisdom and compassion serve as constant reminders that power without understanding leads inevitably to corruption and suffering. Yet the solution is never to abandon the exploration of consciousness's full potential, but to ensure that such exploration is guided by values that serve the well-being of all existence, rather than narrow self-interest. The architectural marvels that each kingdom leaves behind, the Zonai spirals, the sky temples, the twilight palaces, the underwater chambers, function as more than simple monuments to vanished glory. They serve as teaching devices, structures designed to evoke specific states of consciousness in those who encounter them with appropriate receptivity. Their forms encode information about the relationship between space and awareness that can only be transmitted through direct aesthetic experience rather than verbal explanation. The weapons and artifacts that survive from each lost realm carry similar educational functions, their properties designed to challenge users to develop new capabilities and perspectives, rather than simply providing enhanced versions of familiar abilities. The Master Sword, the fused shadows, the various masks and transformation items all require their wielders to transcend normal limitations of identity and capability, serving as catalysts for personal evolution rather than mere tools for achieving predetermined goals. The relationship between individual development and collective evolution that runs through all these stories suggests that personal growth and cultural advancement are not separate processes but different aspects of the same fundamental movement toward greater consciousness and more comprehensive understanding. Kingdoms rise and fall based on the collective spiritual development of their inhabitants, while individual heroes achieve their greatest triumphs when their personal growth serves purposes that transcend narrow self-interest. The geographic distribution of these lost realms above the clouds, below the waves, in parallel dimensions, microscopic spaces, reflected realities demonstrates that consciousness can explore its potential through any conceivable form of manifestation. No environment is too extreme, no scale too large or small. no conditions too challenging to serve as appropriate contexts for the development of awareness seeking to understand its own infinite nature. The temporal relationships between these kingdoms, with their overlapping influences and cyclical renewals, reveal that history itself follows spiral patterns similar to those favored by the Zonai in their architectural designs. Events and themes return at regular intervals, but always at higher levels of complexity and integration, suggesting that time serves consciousness by providing opportunities for deeper exploration of eternal principles, rather than simply carrying experience forward in linear progression towards some ultimate destination. The music and artistic traditions that survive from each realm encode information about the harmonic principles that govern both individual and collective development, demonstrating how aesthetic experience can transmit understanding that exceeds the capacity of purely rational analysis. The songs that control time, the architectural forms that evoke transcendent states, the visual patterns that encode spiritual principles, all serve as vehicles for communicating knowledge that can only be received through direct participation in beauty itself. The ecological relationships that each kingdom developed with its environment reveal different approaches to the fundamental challenge of creating sustainable harmony between consciousness and the natural systems that support physical existence. Some realms achieved perfect integration with their surroundings, while others pushed environmental boundaries to their breaking point, but all demonstrated aspects of the ongoing negotiation between awareness and the material conditions through which it explores its potential. The various forms of governance that emerged in these different kingdoms, from the collaborative harmony of the Picori to the exile-based learning system of the Twilight Realm, represent experiments in organizing collective consciousness for maximum benefit to all participants. Each system reflects different understandings of how individual freedom and collective responsibility can be balanced to create societies that enhance rather than limit the development of their members. The prophetic traditions that guided many of these realms' development suggest that consciousness possesses inherent access to information about its own future possibilities, that awareness can perceive the patterns that govern its evolution, even when immediate circumstances seem chaotic or meaningless. The oracles and seers who appear throughout these stories serve not as fortune tellers predicting arbitrary futures, but as interpreters of the deeper currents that carry consciousness toward its destiny. In the gentle hours when day dissolves into night and awareness settles into the receptive stillness that allows deeper truths to surface from the depths where they have always waited patiently for recognition, these patterns reveal themselves not as abstract principles, but as living realities that continue to shape experience in every moment. The lost kingdoms exist not only in the distant past, but as eternal possibilities within consciousness itself, territories that can be explored whenever awareness develops sufficient courage and wisdom to venture beyond the familiar boundaries of ordinary existence. The cycle continues, as it always has and always must, carrying consciousness through endless explorations of its own infinite creativity, while ensuring that no discovery is ever lost, no wisdom ever permanently forgotten, no beauty ever beyond eventual recovery. The kingdoms may be lost to ordinary sight, but they live forever in the spaces where memory and hope dance together in celebration of the eternal mystery that animates all existence and calls every form of awareness to discover the magnificent truth of what it has always been and can never cease to be. And so our journey through the forgotten realms draws to its natural close, like evening mist settling gently over meadows that have witnessed countless sunsets, yet remain forever touched by wonder. We have walked together through kingdoms that exist now only in whispered theories and half-remembered dreams, territories where the impossible became commonplace, and where consciousness learned to explore the furthest reaches of its own magnificent potential. In these quiet moments, as sleep approaches and the boundaries between waking thought and peaceful rest begin to blur like watercolors in gentle rain, let yourself drift back through all the marvels we have encountered in our wandering. Feel the spiral patterns of the zonai flowing through your awareness like visual music that speaks directly to the soul, their architecture of transcendence, reminding you that form and spirit are partners in an eternal dance, rather than opposing forces competing for dominance over reality. Allow your imagination to soar with the oka through skies that know no limitation, where the very air becomes home and horizon stretches endlessly in all directions toward possibilities that earthbound thinking cannot begin to encompass. Their city, floating beyond the reach of gravity, serves as eternal reminder that consciousness itself possesses wings when it learns to release attachment to the comfortable weight of familiar limitations. Rest in the twilight spaces where the Twili discovered that exile could become education, that the realms between absolute categories often contain the richest opportunities for growth and understanding. Their transformation from dangerous rebels into wise mediators proves that no mistake is so profound that it cannot eventually bloom into wisdom through sufficient patience and genuine dedication to learning from experience. Feel yourself growing small enough to walk among the Picori in their microscopic kingdoms, where every dewdrop becomes an ocean and every grain of sand serves as foundation for civilizations that achieve harmony beyond anything managed by empires whose names echo through history books. Their gentle teaching whispers that significance flows inversely to size, that the mightiest influences work through the most humble means. Let your consciousness expand to encompass the dark world where individual will reshape reality itself, demonstrating both the tremendous creative potential that lies dormant within awareness and the crucial importance of tempering such power with wisdom that serves the well-being of all existence rather than narrow personal desires. Drift through termina where time flows in cycles rather than lines, where repetition becomes refinement, and where even the most traumatic experiences can be transformed into sources of healing and strength through the patient application of love and understanding to the raw materials of suffering and loss. Descend peacefully into the submerged kingdom where Hyrule sleeps beneath waters that preserve rather than destroy, where the deepest treasures of culture and wisdom rest in chambers filled with memories so concentrated they achieve independent existence and continue their work of teaching and inspiration across the centuries. Feel the ancient echoes of the Interloper War reverberating through your awareness. That cosmic conflict which demonstrated how apparent oppositions often conceal deeper complementarities, how forces that seem incompatible can work together to create possibilities that neither could achieve in isolation from the other. All of these realms continue to exist not merely as subjects for theoretical speculation, but as living territories within consciousness itself. Spaces that can be explored whenever awareness develops sufficient courage to venture beyond the mapped territories of ordinary experience into the wilderness, where genuine discovery becomes possible. The patterns that connect all these lost kingdoms reveal themselves as more than historical curiosities or entertaining fantasies, emerging instead as guides for understanding the eternal principles that govern the relationship between individual consciousness and the infinite mystery from which it emerges and to which it inevitably returns, enriched by whatever wisdom its journey has provided. The cycle of kingdoms rising and falling, manifesting and dissolving, being remembered and forgotten and remembered, again reflects the natural breathing of existence itself, that cosmic rhythm which draws awareness through endless experiments in being, while ensuring that no genuine achievement is ever permanently lost to the treasury of accumulated understanding. Some questions are meant to remain forever unanswered, not because consciousness lacks the capacity to discover their solutions, but because mystery itself serves essential functions in maintaining the sense of wonder and possibility that motivates continued exploration. The unknown territories that surround every realm of knowledge create the conditions necessary for growth and discovery to continue indefinitely. The lost kingdoms call to something deep within every consciousness that has ever wondered what lies beyond the edges of familiar maps. What possibilities might exist in the spaces between established categories? What forms of existence might emerge when awareness learns to transcend the limitations it has accepted as permanent features of reality, rather than temporary conveniences for organizing experience? In your dreams tonight, and in all the peaceful nights that follow, may you find yourself wandering through realms where the impossible seems perfectly natural and where every limitation reveals itself as merely another invitation to discover capabilities you never suspected you possessed. May the wisdom of vanished civilizations flow through your sleeping mind like rivers of liquid starlight, carrying insights that will enrich your waking consciousness in ways too subtle for ordinary observation to detect, but too profound for daily experience to ignore. The mysteries remain mysterious not to frustrate curiosity, but to preserve the sense of infinite possibility that makes existence an adventure rather than a predetermined script. The lost kingdoms keep their secrets not from miserliness, but from love, understanding that some treasures can only be discovered through personal exploration rather than received as gifts from external sources. Rest now in the knowledge that mystery and understanding dance together as partners rather than adversaries, that the questions which have no final answers serve to keep consciousness growing rather than allowing it to settle into the comfortable sleep of premature certainty. The unknown beckons not as threat but as promise, not as emptiness but as fullness too great for any single perspective to encompass completely. Let the gentle rhythms of breath and heartbeat carry you into realms where logic dreams and imagination remembers, where the boundaries that seem so solid in daylight reveal themselves as gossamer veils that consciousness can part with the slightest intention to explore what lies beyond the comfortable prisons of familiar assumption. The lost kingdoms await your visit in that space where sleep and waking consciousness meet and merge, where individual awareness touches universal possibility and discovers that it has always been both the seeker and the sought, both the questioner and the answer, both the dreamer and the dream, in the eternal adventure of existence, discovering itself through infinite forms of beauty and wonder and love.